What I will do next is give you a little bit background of who's actually online. Now, I didn't prepare any fancy pie charts on that, but we have around 420 registered participants, and roughly about 30% of that is research and academic institutions. So apparently there's still very high interest from researchers, academics in this topic, and I think it will become quite clear why that is. Then we have about 5% of accreditation and certification bodies, 10% of actual certification schemes such as SPP or FSC, a little bit less than 20% consultants, and 10% end users in our visitor mix today. We also have around 10% of environmental NGOs participating. We have a very small share, around 1% of forest owners in this workshop. We had more in the first two where the focus was also more on the forest owners. About 5% regulators, mainly from the EU, from the European Commission and from various European countries. 10 trade associations are represented, as well as 10 biomass traders. So those are very small fractions out of 420. And overall, I think we can state that we have a very good representation of a number of major societal stakeholder groups, which I think is excellent for the purpose of this workshop. Now, that was a bit of background on the organization and on who's online today. And I will now yield the floor to Dirk Hulverscheid, who will explain, if you haven't figured out yet, the details of using Zoom and HowSpace. Dirk, over to you.
Thanks, Martin. Just 1 second. I will share in the chat box here on Zoom the link to the HowSpace platforms that we're using for our discussions and to do a couple of polls. And yeah, so a very warm welcome from my side as well. Just to give you a very rough timeline as well, is we will have our speakers talking about until 4:15 Central European time. Then we will have about half an hour of a structured written discussion. Given that we have so many participants, we have already over 200 in the Zoom, and probably more will be coming as well. So we really have a couple of areas that we would like to get your opinions on, and that's all going to happen on HowSpace. And then we will afterwards have a short breakout groups to discuss a little bit the findings and see where we actually all agree upon, and then conclude with a plenary discussion, which will be facilitated by Martin again. And then we're going to finish around 6 o'clock sharp, as by the previous ones workshops before. Now, join us on HowSpace. The link to it, if you haven't registered already, is in the chat box on Zoom. If you go and come to the register screen or the login screen, please make sure that you enter your email address inside and then click on the register one, not on the login one. That only works if you have already registered before. Now, when you come to it there, I would recommend you setting up your screen so you can actually follow our Zoom discussion and contribute and view what's going on in the HowSpace at the same time. The easiest way to do so is actually having the Zoom window on the left-hand side of the screen, or make it the top half of your screen, and have a second window, the browser window with a HowSpace opened up right next to it. So that's where you can very easily alternate between the two different programs and follow the speaker. And that's where we're going to share all the live presentations. And then at the same time, you can go and ask your questions, post your comments, or share documents as you like on the HowSpace page. HowSpace, as most of you have already experienced it, is very, very interactive. You can engage with other people directly. You can like somebody else's comments in order to give it more relevance and significance. And you can provide replies directly now and even after the meeting. As we go forward, it's there to have a lively discussion, a lively debate. And yeah, for the next workshop, we have one more webinar coming up. If you go to the top right corner where your little avatar sign is, there is a space where it says add to your bookmarks. So if you don't want to go and look in your emails for the login screen again and again, you can just bookmark it in your browser, and it's a lot easier to go and find. And with that, I give it back to Martin.
Excellent, Dirk. Thank you very much. And after, I hope all the technicalities are clear. If not, then please, you can also put them in the chat if you still need more help with HowSpace and Zoom. I will go now into the background and aims of this workshop series and of the current workshop. So SPP, IEA, and ETIP Bioenergy have organized already 3 workshops before. In the first 2 workshops, we actually focused on the implementation of the RED II and related issues with on member state level, the role of certification schemes, the role of forest owners, etc. 3 weeks ago, we had a workshop on the impacts of the use of woody biomass for on biodiversity. And today's workshop is on carbon, which I think has been the main issue discussed and has regularly popped up also in the previous workshops as one of the key items with regard to the sustainability of woody biomass for energy. Again, we also have a 5th workshop, which Adam Harrison will introduce at the very end in January in 2021. Now, I think as it comes to bioenergy and the climate benefits, few topics have been debated so heatedly, sometimes emotionally and controversially as this one. And it has been going on both in civil society, but also amongst scientists. And we've seen many different rounds of debate with different scientific articles being published by scientists, and where the general public is usually used to a large unanimous voice of scientists saying that climate change is important and real. This voice has not been so clear and unanimous when it comes to the benefits of bioenergy, which I think also has left policymakers to a certain extent in limbo and has confused and concerned the general public, something which we see playing out on various geographical levels, such as the US, the EU, or in my own personal experience, also very much so within the Netherlands. Nevertheless, we also need to move ahead. Bioenergy, woody biomass bioenergy is one of the major contributors currently to the EU and global sustainable energy mix, and is expected to deliver, at least in many scenarios, a significant share in the future as well. So we want to make sure that if this is the case, we do it in a sustainable fashion. And the debate is moving sometimes not very fast, but at the same time, policymaking and the rest of the world is moving ahead. And so I think this debate needs to go ahead as well. The RED II, for example, will be revisited next year already. And so I think providing valuable input on how the climate benefits of woody biomass can be assured in a better way will be very valuable for policymakers, but also other stakeholders in the process. Last but not least, an important part of this background is also that SPP as a certification scheme is currently revising its standards. And the carbon working group under the standards revision is very much also looking for constructive feedback and input on how the existing SPP standard can be improved. Which brings me to the main aims of the workshop. I think we, most of us know already where points of controversy come from. But again, I think one of the aims of today will be to explain the views and underlying concerns and worldviews which motivate the concerns, and to get a better understanding of why we have different views on bioenergy. But also, and perhaps more importantly, to look at where we can find possible areas of agreement amongst a wide area of stakeholders, whether that is possible at all, and if so, which of them are, and ultimately to discuss possible ways forward, how to ensure the use of woody biomass feedstocks that can deliver climate benefits. And I guess one of the main difficulties will be also finding the balance between perfection and practicality. That said, the logic of the workshop is as follows. We will first have Petri Sarvamaa to set the scene as a member of parliament. Then we have Annette Cowie from Australia joining us to explain the different views from science and why different scientists find different climate benefits, even if they study the same system. Then we have Robert Matthews and Pat House, who both will be discussing policy approaches taken in the past or possible in the future, how to regulate sustainable woody biomass and to make sure that there are climate benefits. Then we will have Linde Zuidema from Fern, a Brussels-based NGO, who will explain what the concerns are of her and many other NGOs with regard to the use of woody biomass. And then we will have Richard Peabody from Drax, who is in the unique position of discussing the view of an industrial stakeholder from both the production and consumption side, and why they think biomass can have climate benefits. Last but not least, we will have Aurea Nardelli, RSB certification manager, and she will explain how RSB, a different certification scheme, has taken an approach to ensure the climate beneficial use of biomass. Now, that is the large outline. We have plenty of time to cover, and it is definitely now time to introduce the first speaker of today, which is Petri Sarvamaa. He is a member of the European Parliament since 2012 in the EPP group. He is currently a full member of the Agri Committee and member and vice coordinator of the EPP group in the Committee. He holds the position of Vice President in the EPP's internal working group on budget and structural policies, and he was the rapporteur for the European Parliament's own initiative report on the EU forestry strategy post-2020. And I think as such, he's probably the perfect person to give us the background and set the scene about the policy relevance of this workshop. Petri, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martin. Hello, everyone. First of all, I really want to say that it is a great pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. I might as well point out that I'm both a regulator as a political decision maker, but also a forest owner with about 50 by 100 meters, which is half of an hectare of a little piece of forest that I own as well, so that I just know a little bit what I'm talking about. Dear friends, forestry and the forest-based sector have a crucial role in achieving many of the European Union's objectives, including the Green Deal, the carbon neutrality objective, and the transition to circular bioeconomy. The European Parliament adopted its position on the new EU forest strategy last month. The message is very clear. The economic, the social, and ecological sustainability of forests must all be taken into consideration in a balanced way. The report emphasizes the important role of sustainable forest management, multifunctional role of forests, and the bioeconomy at a time when forestry is playing a major role in the fight against climate change and in the transition to a fossil-free society. We need an ambitious, independent, and holistic EU forest strategy for the post-2020 period. The role of the new EU forest strategy as an effective coordination tool between the various EU forest-related policies should also be promoted. As said, we need, and I underline this word, we need a holistic EU forest strategy for post-2020. In other words, the European Union forest strategy should take into account the forest-based value chain as a whole, and it should promote a stable and predictable regulatory environment. We need continuously new innovations and investments, which are a crucial part in resolving the challenges of our time. However, this holistic point of view should not only concentrate on sustainable forest management, but also on the important services that forests can provide and which are almost completely missing from the current EU discussions. And by this I mean the substitution of fossil-based raw materials and energy. Forests should not only be seen as carbon sinks and neither as compensating for the other sectors' emissions. Nevertheless, the Parliament's position on the EU forest strategy sends a clear and strong message. We need to strengthen the overall climate benefits stemming from forests and the forest-based value chain holistically, including the substitution of fossil-based raw materials and energy, as well as substituting alternatives that have a higher environmental footprint in industries such as construction, textiles, chemicals, and packaging. The use of woody biomass and bioenergy were discussed very thoroughly during the negotiation phase of this report in the Parliament. And it is obvious that very different views exist in this regard. However, the Parliament's report welcomes the continuing work of promoting the most efficient use of wood following the cascading principle. It also calls on the Commission and the Member States to continue the implementation of sustainability criteria for biomass under the recast of the Renewable Energy Directive. and to make optimum use of the substitution effect by substituting CO2 intensive fossil-based materials and energy. The report also highlights that a growing number of EU policies address forests from very different directions. Therefore, we encourage the completion of the ongoing process established by the current EU forest strategy to develop a non-end use driven sustainability approach with the close involvement of the Standing Forestry Committee and the member states, building on the two-step approach of the recast RED II. Indeed, the report highlights the suitability and viability of the two-step approach of Renewable Energy Directive RED II to verifying the sustainability of forest biomass. We also believe that the two-step approach could be used in other policies aiming to ensure the sustainability criteria of forest biomass and the cross-sectorial coherence of EU policies. The Parliament also acknowledges that forestry in the European Union already operates to the highest sustainability standards, and that the sustainability approach for forest biomass must take account of the need for competitiveness of wood as compared to other raw materials. We also encourage the use of market-developed tools, such as the forest certification systems in place, as suitable means of proof to verify the sustainability of forest resources. The report that I navigated through the European Parliament also states that a foreseeable increase in demand for wood and biomass must be accompanied by sustainable forest management. One point which was discussed and highlighted by the majority of political groups in the European Parliament was the use of leftovers at the end of the wood value chain. The Parliament pointed out that they can be favorably used as biomass in order to substitute fossil-based heat, but that where possible, timber should be kept for uses with a longer life cycle in order to increase global carbon dioxide storage. Ladies and gentlemen, the Parliament also highlights the importance of developing and ensuring a market-based bioeconomy in the EU, for example, by incentivizing innovation and development of new bio-based products and making effective use of the biomass materials. And furthermore, the Parliament considers that the European Union should encourage the use of timber, harvested wood products or forest biomass in order to stimulate sustainable production and jobs. And lastly, the European Parliament calls to increase funding for research on the substitution of fossil-based raw materials and energy. In conclusion, the forests and the forest-based sector offer multiple solutions to the challenges of our time, and this should definitely be highlighted across the European Union. And now we just wait anxiously to see what kind of final strategy, forest strategy, the European Commission comes out with in the first quarter of 2021. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petri Sarvamaa. I think this was an excellent introduction to our workshop, and I understand that unfortunately you will not be able to stay with us and join for Q&A because you're off to actually an urgent voting procedure in the European Parliament. So we have a number of comments posted on Housebase. I hope we can send them to you by email, and perhaps you can still get back to them in a few days or so. Thank you so much for your very valuable contribution. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Martin. And unfortunately, really, I have to go. I would love to stay with you, but have a great seminar.
We fully understand. Thank you so much, Petri.
Thanks.
All right. So again, my thanks to Petri. As we now move on, we would like to actually test the water a little bit. And if you navigate to HowSpace, you will see that just on top of the presentation of Annette Cowie, we have inserted a small poll. And we would be very curious to see how the attendees, the participants, view the use of woody biomass to mitigate climate change. And one of the key questions, I think the hot potato in the room, is whether it's acceptable, whether under certain conditions, the use of woody biomass for energy results in an increased greenhouse gas emissions for a limited time. And if you think this is acceptable, then what should be the length of this time period? So if you don't agree at all that bioenergy should never ever lead to any increased greenhouse gas emissions for whatever time span, you can vote 0 years. If you think 10 years is an acceptable time frame to still make a reasonable contribution for climate change mitigation, you vote 10. And if you think that 50 or even more than 50 years is also still making a useful contribution, then please vote accordingly. And we would be interested to see your opinions, because this will be also a very nice introduction for the first presentation. So please take a look on HowSpace. And Dirk, will you be sharing your screen so we can share what the results are coming in? Dirk, you're muted.
Yes, I will, but I would give it first 30 seconds to allow everybody to navigate onto the HowSpace. Yeah, it's directly under Petri's presentation and comments. Here is a poll, and in 30 seconds, I will go and start sharing the outcomes.
Yes, so this I think is one of the strengths of this format of having both a HowSpace and a Zoom page, that we can actually interact with you, the participants, even though this is very hard for all from the home office. This way, I think we can have both a democratic and very interactive and rapid response system to see how different participants think. And I think it's important to emphasize also that there's, in many of the polls we will have today, no right or wrong answer which we envision, but we want to see how participants feel so that we also know where everybody stands roughly in the room. Perhaps also important to point out at this point that the presentations you can see on the HowSpace page have been pre-recorded. For those of you who have not been able to watch it beforehand, I would encourage you to do it still afterwards, because our main presenters will only have 8 minutes to give the key messages, but the presentations themselves are far richer, around 20-25 minutes, most of them, and will give you much more background information if you're interested. Okay, I think with that, 30 seconds have passed.
Yep.
So please let us know, how does the room feel?
So it looks like you've got quite a good majority for 10 years, 28, and 0 years followed by 21.
All right.
Any surprises, Martin?
Well, I would say the 0, 10, and 20 years is 3/4, and the longer time periods is relatively short. That's, I think, a very clear sign, because in many cases, in, let's say, extreme circumstances, we can actually see payback times of longer than 30 years. And if only a small, or if a minority says that would still make a useful contribution to mitigating climate change, then that is a clear signal. At the same time, I think everybody who voted 0 years should be aware of the fact that basically not a single technology, even wind and solar, have payback times of technically 0 years. There's always a few months or years at least. Nevertheless, obviously, 0 years is a clear signal. I think the vast majority of participants here, 37, voted 10 years, and that is, I think, clear. It's a shorter time frame than 20 or 30 years. At the same time, this may actually be quite challenging for many bioenergy systems. So it's a very good view to see how the current audience. I'm also noticing that we have roughly, I think, less than 100 people voted, whereas I can see 211 active participants. So about half of the participants did not vote. If you still want to do so, please do, and we might get back to this result at the end again. But now you've gotten the trick how to operate HowSpace.
Yeah, Martin, before you move on, there was a question about what is the increased GHG emissions benchmarked against?
Haha, that is an excellent question. And that's one we also anticipated. And I think the first speaker of today, Annette Cowie, will explain that measuring this payback time is anything but trivial. And that determining these time horizons, again, has been one of the big hot potatoes in the room. And therefore, I would like to invite Annette Cowie to give her presentation. Annette is Principal Research Scientist on Climate at the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries in Australia, and also work package leader of IEA Bioenergy Task 45 and Climate and Sustainability Effects of Bioenergy within the broader bioeconomy. And she was also previously the task leader of Task 38 with a similar focus. She's also a lead author in the IPCC assessment report, and I think it shows that she is extremely committed because, first of all, she, while being right in the middle of the IPCC process, still freed up time to join us in this workshop. And it is, I think, beyond 2 o'clock in the morning local time in Australia, and still she is live with us to give the presentation. So Annette, I'm very happy and honored that you took this massive effort upon you, and I'm happy to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Martin. Let me see if I can get it right. Okay, my presentation has not quite started up how I expected it to. Is it showing now?
In preview mode, but I think it will work.
Yeah.
Really? I tried to share the other screen that time. Could I just stop and try again? So you're seeing the presenter's mode rather than the...
Exactly, we see your next slide lining up as well.
Okay, I don't know why it did that.
Still the same.
Still the same? But that's really odd. Well, that's really not what I wanted to show you. Apologies, everyone. You'd think by now I could get this right. It's
Microsoft makes it impossible to get it right the first time.
Yes, there we go.
We're right this time? Okay,
Perfect.
Fantastic. Yes, it's not quite 2 a.m. It's only 1:30 at the moment, but I'll use that as my excuse. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today about this vexed issue of how we quantify the climate effects of forest-based bioenergy. I only have 8 minutes, so I won't give a long introduction to who I am and how I come to be presenting this, but as Martin outlined, it's largely to do with my involvement with IEA Bioenergy and the group that looks at climate effects of bioenergy. So you will no doubt, now my slides are not progressing. All right, let's see if this works. Goodness gracious. How about that? There we go. Okay, you will no doubt be aware that there are many studies that show that bioenergy can be beneficial for the climate, and yet there are a range of other studies that suggest that bioenergy is in fact not useful for the climate. And so that is the topic that Martin asked me to address today, how it is that studies can give such different answers and apparently for analysis of exactly the same forestry systems. And part of the answer is because bioenergy is so diverse. Bioenergy comes from a range of different forest systems, a range of different feedstocks. It can include residues such as forest residues, sawmill residues, construction demolition waste. It can be purpose-grown forests. It can be extracted from natural forests. And all those forestry systems are different, have different growth rates, produce different product mixes. The biomass has different properties. And so that's part of the reason for the differences. Also, there are many different bioenergy technologies that can produce bioenergy products, from combustion, co-firing, pyrolysis to production of liquid fuels, and these all have different efficiencies. So it's not surprising that different bioenergy products have different emissions per megajoule of energy product. But the results can also differ between studies due to the analytical methods chosen by the researcher. And that can lead to different results, partly because different people have different perspectives on how you should do these analyses. And that can arise because of different disciplinary traditions or perhaps from different worldviews. One of the most important things to think about is the system boundary. If we look just at the smokestack, we might think that bioenergy has similar or even higher emissions than fossil fuel, than coal, for example. But that comparison misses the point that bioenergy operates within the short-term carbon cycle, whereas the fossil energy system transfers carbon from where it was safely in the ground to the atmosphere, where it causes permanent warming. This is odd. Okay, sorry. My animation's going strange. Anyway, hopefully you get the gist. If we look just at the forest itself, we see the fluctuations in the forest, but we don't see those energy substitution benefits that Petri spoke about. If we look at the whole bioenergy system, we can see that energy substitution benefit, but we miss the wood product sector and those other substitution benefits that Petri mentioned. So in fact, we need to look at the whole bioeconomy so that we can understand the climate effects of incentives for bioenergy. Another aspect of the system boundary is the spatial scale. If you look at a single stand in a forest, you'll see that at the time of harvest, you lose a lot of carbon, you have a lot of CO2 emissions, and then it takes time for the forest to grow back and sequester that carbon. If, on the other hand, you look across the whole landscape, you'll see that a forest estate is managed as a number of different stands that at any one point in time will be at different ages, because the forest is managed to supply a continuous amount of wood. And so if you have the same, this is, sorry, really annoying. If you have the same area of each age class and consistent management, then you'll in fact have pretty stable carbon stocks across the whole forest. But if you change the management to take more residue out, for example, or reduce the rotation length, then you might reduce the average carbon stock in the forest across the rotation, and this difference in average carbon stock would count as a carbon cost of the new management regime. Another key issue is when to start the clock. If you start the assessment at harvest, and then you'll see an immediate emission, and that will create a carbon debt, which is then repaid when the fossil energy is displaced and the trees regrow. On the other hand, if you start after harvest at replanting, then there's no debt, but rather an accumulating credit. But if you look at the landscape scale, then this aspect of when to start the clock won't be an issue. Another important aspect is the reference system and the fate of the biomass in particular if it wasn't used for energy. It might be burnt on site, or it might decay slowly on site. It might be burnt at the sawmill, or perhaps it's wood products that would have gone to landfill, where it might have lasted essentially indefinitely. Another important aspect of the reference system is what is the reference land use. If you're taking biomass out of a forest that's currently managed for timber, perhaps the appropriate reference would be continuing to manage the forest just with the timber extraction and leaving the residues on the ground to decay. Alternatively, you might think that the appropriate reference is stopping harvest altogether and conserving it just to sequester carbon. One of the important issues to think about there is whether there's increased incidence of natural disturbance in a conservation forest like that. This is an example of a study we did in New South Wales looking at our managed native forests that are currently managed for timber production. And we contrasted that with ceasing harvest, and we looked at the carbon stock that would ensue if we did that. So the black line is stop harvest, and the other lines show in green the carbon in the forest, and then the carbon in wood products, and the carbon in the substitution benefits, and the carbon in landfill, assuming that wood products go to landfill, which is what happens in Australia. And you can see that over the longer term, the managed forest has a greater climate mitigation benefit, but there's a period of about 50 years where the conservation option actually has greater climate benefit. And so our poll beforehand is very pertinent here. Most people would think, according to our poll, most people listening today, that 50 years is too long. But we need to remember that the payback time that you calculate is entirely dependent on the counterfactual, and that counterfactual itself is subjective and uncertain. And so we need to think also that the analysis of an individual project misses the bigger picture of the need to tackle climate change as essentially as a portfolio of measures that together will achieve the decarbonisation of our energy system, which is what we really need. So we need to understand how incentives for bioenergy can influence the transformation in the energy sector. And this is an example of a study in Australia looking at the potential for 100% renewables. And what the researchers found was that including bioenergy in the mix, and that's the green blobs that you can see coming in each day in the middle of winter, that actually enabled the electricity to be supplied to Australia at a lower cost, because there was lower installed capacity required if you had bioenergy to fill those gaps when the solar and the wind were low. And so here is a list of all the different reasons for getting different results from analyses of different forest-based bioenergy systems. Some of those are based on inherent differences between the systems, as I explained at the beginning, but very many of them are based on analytical choices. I haven't had the opportunity to mention all of these now, but in my longer presentation, you'll hear me touch on those. And there can be valid reasons for alternative approaches that can be related to different purposes for the assessment. But the most important thing is that researchers should clearly state their approach so that everyone can understand which of those analytical choices they've made, and they should justify those choices, and they should ensure that they are consistent with the goal and the intended application of their study. And I'm well out of time. Sorry, Martin.
You're welcome, Annette, and I have to say I admire you how you managed to squeeze in what I usually teach in 2 hours in less than 10 minutes, so compliments for that. I can see on Housebase the number of questions already rapidly increasing, and that's what we also will do. So rather than having a Q&A right now, I would encourage everybody who has a question to Annette to put them on Housebase. Annette will try to answer the short ones, if possible, directly, and pick a few ones at the end of the session of the first plenary, where every speaker will get the opportunity to react to 1 or 2 questions. So with that, I would like to move to the next speaker, which is Robert Matthews. He is Research Program Group Manager at the Forestry Commission and has worked extensively on issues related to greenhouse gas balances and the use of forest biomass for bioenergy production from, amongst others, the European Commission and the European Climate Foundation. He has been working on developing regulatory approaches, how to ensure the use of woody biomass with climate benefits, and we've seen his work being referred to several times in previous workshops already. So, Robert, you are quite the celebrity, and we really look forward to your 8-minute summary.
Thank you very much, Martin. Can everyone hear me?
Loud and clear.
I have to say I'm absolutely dreading presenting this. Thank you, Dirk. I believe you're going to present these slides for me. We won't use any of the vocals on this. So I've been asked to speak about possible approaches to regulating the use of woody biomass to ensure climate benefits. So no challenge there. If we can move on to the next slide, please. This is what we used to think about how to regulate woody biomass used for energy. We just needed to encourage its use and get the climate benefits, because bioenergy is carbon neutral. And this is a diagram that I am the culprit for designing some years ago, that illustrates the thinking at that time, the dogma, which is that you can grow biomass and then harvest, and that sequesters the carbon, and then you release the carbon, and you have this virtuous circle of the cycling of carbon between the biomass and the energy generation system. Well, that's the old thinking. Next slide. What do we understand to be the position now? And obviously, I do not have time to present the complexity in this slide, but if you look at my long presentation, there's a long discussion of what this slide is telling you. And what it's telling you is that the little dots represent the climate benefits or non-benefits of different options for using harvested wood from an example forest system. It happens to be a quite fast-growing forest system in the UK. And the different dots represent different uses of the wood, ranging from what we call typical mixes at the bottom left-hand corner of the graph, up to all of the harvested wood, every single ton of biomass being used for energy. And this is compared against certain horizontal lines representing stopping harvesting and allowing the trees to sequester carbon. And you can see different time horizons are considered as well. And the option of having no forest is also there as a comparator. What this tells us is that we can't simply assume that biomass harvested for products, including bioenergy, results in a simple result. It's not just carbon neutral. The impacts on the carbon balance and on the overall greenhouse gas balance can be very variable. You can also see that there are, interesting that Petri, when he opened this meeting, was talking about not just focusing on the carbon sequestration potential of forests, but also on their substitution potential. Well, be careful with that one, because there are trade-offs between prioritizing substitution and prioritizing sequestration. And you've got to get the balance right. But what a graph like this should show you is that the variation that you see in outcomes in terms of how you harvest wood and how you use it is systematic. We can understand it. And that raises the question, can it be managed? Next slide. So if it can be managed, what are the possible approaches to regulation? And I should emphasize here, I'm a researcher. I'm not a policy analyst. So this is just my personal opinion. You could have a system where you require consumers or producers to demonstrate quantified greenhouse gas reductions arising from their supply of bioenergy and its consumption. Well, you'd need an agreed methodology, and I think Annette showed you, well, good luck with that one. Although it could be done, it will be complicated. The transaction costs will be expensive, and it may be difficult for producers and consumers to look at the cumulative effect of several actors operating in the same area of forest. An alternative would be to require the actions would be to require actors to demonstrate that their actions in the forest and in the use of bioenergy are giving greenhouse gas reductions. That would need agreement on what the good actions are, and you'd need to somehow verify that those actions are being taken on the ground. Another option is to stick to safe options. We would need agreement on what the safe options are, and I would suggest personally that that is significantly suboptimal. I did see one commentator commenting that surely the precautionary principle applies if there's uncertainty surrounding this. And I get that point, but I must also suggest that precautionary in what sense? Because it could be precautionary in terms of avoiding harvesting, but precautionary in terms of avoiding the failure to use an important resource that could in some circumstances contribute to a carbon neutral solution. Finally, there's feedstock regulation. I would submit that is a blunt instrument. I hope that translates. And something more sophisticated may be needed. If we could look at the next slide, please. Okay, here we go. So here's what I'm talking about when I suggest something a bit more sophisticated. This is a decision tree that would allow a producer or consumer to sift out good biomass from bad biomass. It's quite complicated, but it's more complicated than it looks. It's actually quite easy to follow this decision tree. And for any particular biomass supply chain, you may find that many of these branches just aren't relevant. And it enables you to filter biomass sources or categorize them into high risk, moderate risk, and low risk of adding to greenhouse gas emissions from bioenergy use. It's only a proposal. It's not supposed to be the last word, but it's giving you an idea of how it could possibly be done. Next slide, please. If you don't like that complexity of a decision tree, then here's some example criteria and a simpler decision tree that enables you to, there's an initial set of criteria not shown here, which look at forest management practices. They're quite helpful because actually if you can show that your management is consistent with those practices, then you don't necessarily need to consider wood feedstocks that you're using. But if you don't want to do that, then you consider these wood feedstock criteria. And you could possibly use these to, again, to sift and determine whether the biomass that you're using is consistent with achieving low greenhouse gas emissions and therefore a good chance of substitution. And the last slide, please. So that's my roller coaster ride through biomass regulation possibilities, as I emphasize, a non-policy analyst. Please look at the full presentation where more detail is given. But in conclusion, I would suggest we're not there yet, but I would say regulation is getting better and better, and I would acknowledge the efforts made in the European Union to address this, but I suggest there are still gaps. I would also say don't give up. There could be options, there will be challenges, but generally black and white rules, particularly about the use of feedstocks, don't really work. They're not really effective. It's necessary to make sure that policy works for the purpose intended and to distinguish clearly between policies that work towards different goals. A policy aimed at international direction and cooperation is not appropriate, for example, for sending the right signals to actors on the ground. Martin Junginger already commented on the need for a balance between perfection and practicality. And in this sense, I would suggest sending a signal to biomass consumers and producers about what they can do is at least as important as telling them what they can't do. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Robert. That again was an impressive summary of a very complex topic. And like Robert said, I would like to encourage everybody who has not seen the full presentation to do so. We did a lot of effort and time to record it. So I think you should definitely take the 20 minutes and watch it in full detail. Again, I see lots of comments popping up underneath Robert's presentation, and Robert already has answered a few of them. So please go ahead and ask some more while we move on to the next presentation, which is from Pat Howes. Pat Howes is an independent researcher with 30 years of experience in renewable energy and especially bioenergy systems. In the past, she has also been leading IA Bioenergy Task 36 Energy from Waste. And she has also worked for Ricardo IAA, where she in 2016 worked on an extensive study for DEC, nowadays BASE, on the assessment of high carbon scenarios for North American woody biomass for the use in the UK electricity mix. And in the next 8 minutes, she will share the main highlights and conclusions of that study as one concrete example of how policymakers have attempted to regulate the use of woody bioenergy. Pat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin. Thanks for that introduction. Now, I've only got one screen, so I'm hoping I can share the screen. There we are, and show you my presentation. Can everybody hear me first?
Loud and clear.
Good. And can you see my screen now?
Perfectly.
Great. Okay. So thanks for the introduction, Martin, and thank you. And the other organisations, other organisers for inviting me to give this presentation. It's gone backwards, excuse me. It's about a piece of work I did in 2016 on the use of North American woody biomass in UK electricity generation. And it was about the assessment of high carbon biomass fuel sourcing scenarios. It's quite a complicated piece of work, and I'm going to try and summarise it in 8 minutes. So all I'll do is provide a bit of context, briefly describe what we did, and then go on and talk about the results and the conclusions. All the work is available on the internet, and on my last slide, I provide the URLs for the work. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge a few people and thank a few people. I was part of a team at Ricardo Energy and Environment when I did that work. I'd like to thank the UK Department of Energy and Climate Change, which was DEC at the time, it's now BASE, and they funded the work. Excuse me, my thing's going ahead of me. Go back. I'd like to thank the North American consultants who are part of the team and helped us. And I'd really like to thank the large number of stakeholders in North America who contributed to what was really quite a complex study and gave quite a lot of their time to the work. So let's do a little bit of background. I think it helps understanding why we did the work. The work was about whether or not high carbon fibre supply scenarios in North America are likely to supply fibre for pellets used in electricity production in the UK. But it came about as a result of some work commissioned by DEC in 2014 on a model called the Biomass Emissions and Counterfactual Model that I'm going to refer to as BEAC from now on. Now, DEC supported a modelling exercise examining 55 scenarios in BEAC, and that was published in 2015. And this work concluded that while there was adequate supply, low carbon supply for the UK market demand, there were 28 scenarios that were high carbon, and they didn't say how likely these scenarios were, but obviously DEC was concerned that we wouldn't take biomass from the high carbon scenarios. And so in 2015, they commissioned another study. And this is the aims of that study. Essentially, DEC wanted an evidence base on the likelihood of the 28 high carbon scenarios, with an indication of how strong the evidence was and where the major uncertainties were. And they added an additional number of scenarios, making 40 in total. So that actually gave us quite a large, I don't know why my slide keeps going straight on. I'll have to keep taking it back if it carries on doing this, but let's carry on. So that shows we were looking at quite a large number of scenarios. Now, the high carbon scenarios included some scenarios that are not normal forestry practice. And there are no models that consider this kind of scenario. And when we talked to modelers, they said, actually, you can't alter our models to include them. So you can't just review the literature, use some models and come up with an answer. In addition, much of the data that was needed to understand these scenarios was commercially sensitive. And that's sensitive to the forestry sector. So it's not widely available in the literature. So our method reflects this. We did a literature review, and the idea of that was to provide some kind of context to the study, to examine the extent and the types of forest, for example, to look at ownership, governance, etc., regulations and so on. Then we did a survey of North American experts, and this was by far the largest part of the work. And then we did some economic modelling using the Southeast Subregional Timber Supply Model, SRTS, which was developed at North Carolina State University. And in my presentation, I don't talk about that modelling, but I have posted something in-house, so you can look at that, and also it's all available there in the reports that I provide. So to identify stakeholders in North America, we included North American experts who were invaluable in the work and who also guided us in the literature review. They helped us contact key stakeholders, and they did the modelling for us. So the results are detailed in the technical reports, and that's referenced at the end of the presentation. I'm just going to provide a high-level overview here. So the evidence base indicated that the majority of the high carbon scenarios were unlikely to occur, but there were 4 scenarios that may already be happening or may happen in the future at limited or uncertain scale. It also indicated that the main value in the tree is the saw timber, and the needs of the saw timber market are what actually dictate the harvest. So some of these scenarios envisage the harvest happening in a completely different way, and unless that actually benefits the saw timber, it's probably unlikely to happen. Finally, it concluded that foresters are unlikely to change their behaviour to harvest sooner than intended to supply biomass demand. Sorry about this, but they may increase the intensity of forest management in response to biomass demand. So let's look at those likely scenarios. Let's drill down a little bit more. You'll notice I said 4 earlier on, there are 5 here, and that's because we've actually included one that was low carbon, but it was linked to a high carbon scenario, and I'll talk about that when we get through to that one. So the most likely of these scenarios were the first 2 scenarios involving the removal of coarse residues in Southeast USA. But both pellet mills and pellet users said they don't really want more than 20% of such residues in their plants. The scenario that was low carbon but linked to a high carbon scenario is the next one, additional wood being taken from intensively managed coniferous plantations in Southeast USA. Now, the high carbon scenario envisaged this would happen on a shorter rotation, and the respondents said no, it wouldn't happen on a shorter rotation, but it was likely that they would take additional wood from intensively managed coniferous plantations. The other 2 scenarios were additional harvest from the conversion of naturally regenerated forest in Southeast USA to an intensively managed pine plantation. And the final one was bringing undermanaged wood or unmanaged wood into management in Southeast USA. And this refers mainly to the significant amount of woodland in Southeast USA that's owned at small scale by families. This woodland isn't subject to management plan, but it could come under a management plan at harvest. And just an aside here, Robert Perbody is going to talk later on, and he'll probably talk about that kind of forest system. So just looking quickly at the conclusions, On supply, we found the most likely supply strategies are those that are integrated into the supply of higher value product chains that already exist, and I've listed those here. In addition, we found the use of wood from some hardwoods in Southeast USA was clearly controversial. Actually, what's happening on the ground wasn't clear to us, and we recommended that for that situation, more evidence is required on what's happening. On economics, fibre is a major cost of pellet production, and the mills indicated they couldn't tolerate high fibre price increases. So just increasing the price of fibre wasn't necessarily going to pull out more fibre from the forest. There was a key dynamic between market conditions and pellet fibre availability, which dictates the type of fibre that's available and the amount that's available. In other words, this is all to do with saw timber harvest. When there's a large saw timber demand, you then have large saw timber processing, and you have a large amount of processing residues, some of which could find their way into the pellet chain. But when there's low saw timber demand, you have the converse situation. And then in those situations, you might be more likely to take stuff from the forest. On regional differences, sawmill residues are very important at the moment, but that additional harvest could come from the forest if it's included in their annual allowable cut and management plans. And in the Southeast USA, for a number of scenarios, the motivations of small-scale forest owners determine the harvest, and that's got nothing to do with the market very often. So my final slide is kind of reflecting back on all of this after 3 years, I think it is, since the work was finished. Firstly, I'd say that the key general conclusions are often the most obvious, but they are important. I think, as the other two speakers have already shown, it's very difficult to turn dynamic forestry practice into carbon scenarios. And frequently, what's happening in other markets dictates how pellet fibre is actually sourced. In other words, it's not driving the harvest, but supply reacts to the dominant market and is responsive to other drivers and other pressures. And our results showed that in forest carbon modelling, assumptions, scenarios, counterfactuals, sorry, I'm getting feedback here, definitions influence the outcome. In response to that, kind of like the other two speakers have already said, scenarios have to be realistic. Pellet production is most likely to be integrated into the management of forests for other forest products. It's often difficult to know the true counterfactual. For counterfactual modelling, we need to involve stakeholders underground to make those counterfactuals realistic. We had tremendous problems with terminology and definitions, and the different stakeholders had different definitions, particularly for things like residues. And we can't extrapolate from one region to another. It's obvious. Canada is very difficult to the Southeast USA. You can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. So in summary, I think that modelling of forest carbon can definitely identify potential poor practice which guides standards and policy, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Economics, financial return, practicalities, forest owner motivations, and other things are all pivotal in determining whether a scenario actually happens. So conclusions and decisions based on modelling alone have to, really, they have to take these realities into account. And that's all I want to say. I'm just going to leave you with the final slide, which is also my presentation on house space, so that you can access all of the reports I talk about. That's
Thank you very much, Pat. In slightly more than 8 minutes, I'm afraid, but I fully understand the challenges of summarizing the magnitude of the study in 8 minutes or so. Again, I would encourage everybody to post their comments on content, not so much in the chat of Zoom, but on HouseSpace, where Pat will also have an opportunity to actually respond to them, and where it's much clearer for everybody what replies and answers are. In the interest of time, I would like to rapidly move on to Linda Zuidema. Linda is working for Fern, a Brussels-based campaigning organization working on EU policies to protect forests and people's rights. She has been working on bioenergy and EU policies since 2012, and she will highlight Fern's concerns with regard to the use of woody biomass and possible regulatory approaches to mitigate those concerns. Linda, the floor is yours. And I think, Pat, you probably need to stop sharing your screen so that
I can't get onto the bottom of this.
There we go.
Okay.
Then I hope that Linda will be able to share hers. Yes, it's starting. Very nice. Linda, we can all see it perfect.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone. I'll try to be quick. My longer presentation is also online, so don't hesitate to go there. While the previous speakers have zoomed into the state of play of the science, I'm taking more of a regulatory perspective in this presentation. So I will speak about the use of solid forest biomass use in the heating and power sector mainly, and its climate impact in light of EU ambition, as well as of the EU regulatory approach in this area. So first, why are we talking about this, and why is it important in light of our climate ambition? So with the Paris Agreement, as we all know, we've committed internationally to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The latest science indicates that we could reach 1.5 degrees already by 2025 and 2 degrees a decade later. So that's quite daunting. This will already have severe impacts, obviously, of which some are already visible today in terms of a changing climate, health, food security, migration, and so on. So the urgency of the climate crisis and the rapidly declining carbon budget make it an absolute priority to radically reduce emissions now, but is also a reason why burning biomass carbon is becoming more difficult to justify by the day. And that was already shown by the responses of all of you earlier to the first poll of this session. So to zoom into that issue, and this was already mentioned by the previous speaker. So biomass burning is associated with a range of emissions, from smokestack emissions to processing emissions, and an effect on the ability of forests to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So if we look at these two figures, on the left side, you see emissions from the public power and heat production sector in the EU. So this excludes a significant chunk of emissions from biomass burning in the heating sector, right? What does this graph tell us? The green line shows you a rather positive trend of a decrease in emissions from burning solid fuels, part of which is due to the substitution with solid biomass. But at the same time, you see a significant increase in emissions from burning biomass since the early 2000s, so shown by the light blue line in this graph. While smokestack emissions from burning would exceed those from burning coal, and the carbon payback time can take decades, the substitution of fossil fuel with biomass may increase emissions for a substantial amount of time. And this is further, or can be further amplified by a possible negative effect from intensification of forest management on the ability of forests to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So this, and this is what you see now happening in the EU. You see a rapidly declining sink, which is shown by the figure on the right side. And this sink is projected to decline further to 2030. And this is the opposite of what the Paris Agreement requires, namely to reduce emissions rapidly and to enhance forest carbon sinks. In this context, it's welcome that the EU has set itself a target for climate neutrality by 2050 and is negotiating increased ambition towards 2030. But to reach these goals, forest and land will need to step up their role for climate change mitigation, and which is here shown by the green the green bar under the line 0. And this has particular implications for how we manage forests and how we use wood in the economy. Just to briefly touch on other objectives in the European Green Deal, we have also, the Commission has recognized with this deal to align increased climate action with other objectives, such as on air quality, biodiversity protection, efficient resource use, and efficient public spending. And investment in increased biomass use is a difficult match here, and that's because burning solid biomass has increased air pollution compared to fossil fuels since 2005, has quite a big policy blind spot, and an increasing use of the EU wood harvest is going to short-lived uses such as energy. So this is also problematic in light of efficient resource use. And at the same time, forest management forms one of the biggest pressure for forest habitats and species in the EU, which are in quite a bad shape at the moment. So this is all problematic in the context that member states are putting billions of euros in this biomass technology at the expense of other technologies that are cleaner in the short and long run. So these, just very briefly, is also recognized by a recent report on cost of different renewable energy technologies, but these negative impacts of biomass burning are leading to significant cost compared to other renewable energy technologies. And why is that important? Because they are at the moment not really taken into account in our investment decisions on how we are spending renewable or public funds on renewables. So I won't get into the details here, but it's important to say that that while the Renewables Directive determines that burning forest biomass can count towards RES targets and can be supported with public resources, we are not really adequately assessing the cost effectiveness of forest biomass, both in terms of negative cost and its actual climate impact. So to discuss in more detail what our regulatory perspective is that the current sustainability approach in the Renewables Directive we see that as an important sort of part of the discrepancy that I was just referring to with regards to how we invest, we make investors' decisions. And the risk-based approach in the Renewables Directive, it focuses very much on sustainable production of biomass and sustainable forest management criteria and LULUCF accounting. And we believe that those do not effectively address the risk of increased harvesting for bioenergy and related climate and biodiversity and impact, air pollution or resource efficiency. And I'd like to take the example of the climate impacts here. So as science shows us, the climate impact of biomass burning is largely dependent on which feedstocks are used, on the scale of deployment and end-use efficiencies, as well as counterfactuals. But these focus on sustainable forest management rules don't address these issues at all. So harvesting a tree from a sustainably managed forest doesn't mean that it's sustainable or climate friendly to then burn that tree. Even if you would argue that sustainable forest management would help enhance forest carbon sinks over time, which is clearly not the case today. Plus, betting on future management decisions, in our view, is turning biomass use in kind of a risky offsetting scheme. So it is important that policies are aimed at discouraging any harvesting for renewable energy, both harvesting trees as well as residues. And to also mention LULUCF, so the risk-based.
One
Yes.
check. We're still seeing the slide risk-based approach on our screen. I think
yes.
Yes, that's correct. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I have one or two more slides. That's it. So on LULUCF, there are a few flaws in relying on LULUCF to kind of prove that bioenergy has climate benefits, and these or to provide incentives that prevent increased harvesting for bioenergy. And I won't get into the details, but these relate to how the emissions from forestry are accounted for, data reliability, but also a kind of lack of equivalency, if you want, with how we price in emissions in other sectors, and in a world with a developing carbon price and so on. Plus, this system doesn't effectively capture emissions from biomass imports either. So this leads to the broader point, and hence this image really is that in our view, it's naive to think, and this relates to the point brought up earlier about a precautionary approach, that the risk-based approach as such, which is quite weak in the context of other policies that incentivize the use of forest biomass for energy, which includes the Renewable Energy Directive, but also the Energy Efficiency Directive, the EU ETS as such, and taxation exemptions and EU funds. So it should be looked at in a more holistic regulatory view from our point of view. And at the same time, it's concerning that, according to the Commission's own assessment, member states have not assessed or disclosed the negative impacts from biomass burning in their NECPs. And this proposes a real challenge in the light of the climate and biodiversity crisis. There is a need to reduce emissions now, and protect and restore forests should be a priority. Data shows increasingly the negative impacts from biomass burning on the climate and on biodiversity, air pollution, and so on. But despite, or perhaps facilitated by the risk-based approach, member states are planning to burn more forest biomass between now and 2030. And at the same time, they're not considerate or transparent about the negative impact. So without effective safeguards, it's not justified to rubber stamp the burning of forest biomass, of increasingly use of forest biomass as a renewable, and allow for investments on an equal footing with other renewable technologies. I think I'll have my last slide here. So we see there are a number of options for a different approach. One would be to take a closer look at which feedstocks are allowed, or to, for example, exclude all forest biomass or all biomass directly harvested from forest, and only allow for industrial residues to be used, which could be considered the most kind of precautionary approach in this context. And other restrictions could be to look at subsidies and increasingly end-use restrictions. I think the MEP earlier, who spoke earlier today, Mr. Saravarme, he said that he pointed at the need to discuss a circular bioeconomy, but then to still prevent to talk about end-use restrictions. But at the same time, you can wonder, why are we allowing for public investments in energy use of biomass only, while in a light where we want to maybe promote a circular bioeconomy? So I do think that we need to move into the direction of talking about end uses, especially for heating and power production, where we have alternatives available to us. And a third point that I think is very important is to look at how we effectively price in emissions from biomass burning in the regulatory framework. So thank you very much for the opportunity to say some words about our view in this area. We very much welcome the Green Deal ambition of the EU and the role and the emphasis on forests. We do think at the same time it's a momentum to trigger a sustainable transition for forests and the forestry sector. That can help in mitigation efforts, and this is fair for people and nature. We do think that revisions in the LULUCF regulation may be able to help, but it needs to be coupled with policy revisions in other areas, and notably the Renewables Directive, to limit or prevent an increasing lock-in of limited biomass resources in the energy system. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Linda. And we're increasingly running out of time, but I think this is all very valuable input. I can see the questions below your house space presentation rapidly increasing, so I suggest that we move on while you try to answer perhaps already a few of them already. So we will now move on to Richard Pepperdy, Vice President Sustainability at Drax and also part of the SPP Carbon Working Group. As Drax is probably one of the few industrial stakeholders that can provide both a biomass producers and user perspective, we have invited Richard to present his views on how to manage and use forest biomass for energy to achieve climate benefits. Richard, the floor is yours.
Hi, Martin. Since we're behind, I suggest Dirk just loads the presentation, the 8-minute presentation, and we go for it.
Right, let me just...
Hi, my name's Richard Pepperdy, and I work for the Drax Sustainability team. Thank you to IEA and SPP for the opportunity to talk today, and to you for your interest. At Drax, we burn about 7 million tonnes of pellets each year at our power station.
Still looks small, Dirk.
Oh, okay, let me just see if I can... Oh. Is it better now?
Screen.
Yes.
Yes. We also take significant quantities of pellets from the Baltics and from Western Canada. We've been using pellets at scale since 2013, so there's now a body of data that describes how forests have responded to our demand and how our demand has impacted other markets. For the purpose of this summary of the catchment area analyses that we've done, looking at those catchments, I'm going to take a super fast look at the headlines from 3 regions from which we source and see what that tells us about the biomass demand and forest carbon. I won't be able to do justice to the wealth of information in the reports, I'm afraid, so I hope you've had a chance to read them. The slide shows the regions for which we've posted reports on our website, and all the data is publicly available. Through a series of reports that we've called catchment area analyses, we've taken a deep dive into the data that we can find in each catchment. All the reports are available on our website, and I invite everyone to have a look at them and the associated blogs. This slide has the core metrics that are examined in detailed in the reports. This audience won't need me to go through why these are important. The reports have many other insights too. Starting with the report covering the 2 pellet mills in the centre of British Columbia, named Burns Lake and Houston, we'll have a look at what happened there. These forests are government-owned and managed, having forest management certification in place. But the image tells you the central story of this supply area. Mountain pine beetle killed millions of hectares, leading to accelerated harvests in the region to make sure the wood could be used as lumber before its quality deteriorated. The sawmills geared up to produce more saw timber, and pellet mills provided a good use for mill residuals that otherwise would have been burnt without energy recovery. So the story for a decade or more has been straightforward, and an example of how having a market for pellets can help communities and industries respond to things like beetle attack or wildfire or other forest damage. Sadly, such events are becoming more common. The beetle attack changed these forests, and going forward there'll be less sawmilling than there has been, so a growing source of feedstock is material felled as part of harvest for saw logs that would otherwise have been burnt at roadside. Moving on to another important sourcing area, Latvia and Estonia. We can see that we can see some of the details on the screen. Between them, they have 5.4 million hectares of forest, which produce over 3 million tonnes of pellets each year. About half the forest land is FM certified, forest management certified, and ownership is a mixture of public and private. And it's the ownership story that is the main driver here. Previously part of the Soviet Union, land has now returned to be governed more locally. The top chart has a grey segment titled restitution lands, which in Soviet times were largely communal farms and were not well managed. But in recent years, with ownership returning to state forest agencies and increasingly to professionally run forestry companies, forest management has improved. And on the slide, you see the consequence of that. Increased forest area, increased productivity, and increasing amount of stored carbon. And pellet demand has not impeded the growth of other forest products. In the Baltics, pellets are produced from mill residuals and from roundwood. The first has helped sawmill economics. The second has provided a useful outlet for low-grade roundwood. The stands have been thinned or improved and can now produce more saw material. Turning to our main sourcing area of the US South, a really important characteristic of this sourcing area is the amount of forest in private ownership, over 80%. There isn't much forest management certified land, perhaps 15%, but the main procuring companies that work in the area are signed up to a due diligence system called SFI certified sourcing. There is a lot of forest industry in the US South. With just 7% of the world's forest lands, they produce 15% of the world's forest products. We have 5 reports covering this important region. In my longer PowerPoint in the reports themselves, there's more detail as to how we've defined each catchment. The important thing is to understand that each of these areas are those from which pellets actually originated. And on the screen, you can see an image of probably the most important data point, that forest inventories have continued to grow after the extra demand for biomass emerged. The slide also has other key headlines: stable forest area, so no deforestation, sustained productivity, no displacement of solid wood products, and so on. In the longer presentation, I spent some time digging deeper into the forest dynamics of the US South. And this slide has a relevant graph. What it shows you is that over time, over the decade since 1952, forest area has been relatively stable at 82 to 85 million hectares. But the demand increased hugely from 140 cubic meters per year back in the 1950s to over 270 million cubic meters per year in the 1990s. The harvests are predominantly for sawlogs and pulpwood year in, year out. Whole trees is a word some might use for them. Yet the forest inventory increased all the way through that time and has more than doubled since 1952 to nearly 11 billion cubic meters today. And this slide shows how it happened. You can see on the chart on the right, the productivity on each hectare more than doubled. Growth went from 2 cubic meters per hectare per year to nearly 5. And the words below the charts show how that happened. Essentially, forest owners invested in better forestry. They planted better trees, they had better silviculture, they established the trees more thoroughly, and the forest responded. The central point here is there are many responses to increased demand, not just extra felling. And taken at a regional level, these all happen at the same time. The figures from the US South, shown 2 slides ago, show that this has happened for decades over millions of hectares. The strength of the relationship between demand and increasing inventory is captured in the graph at the bottom of the screen. And some of the mechanisms are described in the bullet points. For the US South, our catchment area analyses reveal the same dynamic, that even as our demand has come into the market, inventories have continued to increase. And it turns out that recent research by Aguilar, Mirzai, and McGarvey finds the same thing. They compared data from measured forest plots, some in pellet catchments and some not. And they found that the catchments around pellet mills had larger sea stocks than those without. And there has been a contemporaneous response. These forest landscapes have responded in real time. No wait for a sequestration. The totality of the landscape level response has delivered a beneficial carbon response. So this is my final slide. In the longer presentation, it was a struggle to summarize the hundreds of pages of analysis, and it's harder still in just 8 minutes here. But I conclude with a few key points. It is possible to collect metrics that talk to carbon dynamics. When you have the numbers, you can start to understand the drivers of dynamics. You can choose between good biomass and bad biomass. You are highly unlikely to get the full story by looking at a single tract. It's a regional view that provides a full picture. Another key finding is that carbon payback times may be relevant in some circumstances, but in others, such as the US South, they seem hardly relevant at all. Thinking back to how US forests responded to increased harvesting since 1952, it's clear it's not the feedstock type that matters. You know, many of those were whole trees. It's the impact of using that feedstock that matters. Scientists tell us that in order to respond to climate change, we need good biomass energy as part of that mix, and carbon capture and storage if we're to make 1.5 degrees or anywhere close. And the data coming back to us after these first few years of production at scale shows that this can be done, and it also shows it can be measured. We should be encouraged by this. As the last few words, I'd just like to thank my fellow speakers for their contribution to the debate and the people who undertook the catchment area analysis on our behalf, but especially to the scientists who've helped us understand this vital subject better. And I invite you again to look at the reports on our website. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for this recorded presentation. Again, I see lots of questions popping up. So Richard, please go ahead and try to answer perhaps a few of them, while in the meantime, we give the floor to our final speaker of the first plenary session, which is Aurea Nardelli. She's RSP Certification Manager, responsible for the RSP certification system globally, and she will talk about the role of certification schemes for the use of woody biomass for energy and the approach that RSP has taken to ensure that only those feedstocks are certified that are sustainably produced and achieve significant emission reductions. Aurea, please go on.
Okay, thank you. Good day, you all. I will share my screen, just a minute. And thank you for the introduction. And also thanks for the other speakers, because a lot of interesting aspects to discuss, and I learned a lot. Thank you. Just to share my screen, just a minute. Please let me know if you are seeing my screen. Yes? Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we can see it, but
okay,
not yet in presentation mode. So if you press F5.
Okay. Yes, just I go to here. It's now?
Perfect.
It's good now? Okay, thank you. Just I just close my video. Okay, so RSB was invited to talking about the role of the certification schemes for wood biomass. So our presentation will be not based on investigation or research projects, but our experience as a certification scheme in develop specific requirements for wood biomass to be applicable in the certification of different type of products. So the next slide, yes. So RSCB is the Roundtable Sustainable Biomaterial. We are a global multi-stakeholder independent organization, and we work with our members, with a diversity of members from industry, NGOs, institutions of research, universities, and different types of organizations. And we are together sharing a vision to contribute to a just transition to a net positive world. And we work through sustainability solutions, and certification is one of the solutions that we offer to our members and our partners and to different type of operators in the biomaterials, biomass, but also non-bio-based sectors. Just to let you know that RSB can cover wood biomass. We are not a specific certification scheme focused on forestry or forest certification, but we cover multi-feedstocks and multi-products. So we are able to certify different type of materials for different type of sectors, and also wood-based biomass for bioenergy, but also for biomaterials, for example, polymers, textiles, and fibers, other type of markets. Considering this, we have our core standard, that is the RSB Global Standard. It's a voluntary certification schemes able to cover energy, but also non-energy products. And under this specific system, we can certify advanced fuels and also advanced products, smallholders, groups, and also we have other specific methodologies related to a low risk of indirect land use change, and methodologies for displacement emissions. And considering the regulatory adaptations, RSB is recognized by RED 1 since 2011. And we just apply for the recognition for RED 2. And we apply also for the recognition of ICAO CORSIA to certify sustainable aviation fuels that can also be produced using wood biomass. And we have the recognition of the RSB Japan standards to certify biomass for power generation in Japan. This specific standard is covering palm kernel shells and palm trunks. It's not for wood biomass in general, but for a specific type of palm residuals. And all of these schemes share the same sustainability requirements, the RSB principles and criteria. And in the RSB principles and criteria, we have a principle 3 that cover the GHG emissions. So under RSB principle 3, we have provisions for a calculation of the GHG emissions, and also we established the threshold for reductions expected from different type of materials and also for biofuels. To talk more about the role of the certification systems, we believe that the core of the certification systems is to ensure credibility. So to work, especially in the case of wood biomass, with so many controversial passions involved, it is very important to have a robust system in place. So we believe that a certification system working in this space needed to ensure multi-stakeholder engagement, not only in the standard setting process that is crucial, but also during the assurance, to follow good codes of practice, for example, the ISO codes for assurance, for standard setting, but also for impact monitoring, to have oversight mechanisms to ensure quality and independence of the audits, and also to be open to participate in independent benchmarks and also to apply for global recognitions. We'll talk a little bit more about our experience in developing requirements for wood biomass. We have a recent experience with a working group starting to work in February this year. And it started with some discussions, internal discussions, because we already have in our standard, as I told you, in principle 3, provisions for the GHG calculation for different type of materials. And in case of wood biomass, we have provisions for residues from forestry harvesting process, residues from industrial process, and short rotation copses. And we understand from our members that we need to discuss more about other type of materials, because some members are interested in using some materials from demolition, others from construction sites, others thinking about, for example, mango trees from orchards that are renewed. So there are different type of materials, and we need internal discussions to understand better the risks associated with this type of materials, and also how we will ensure that our sustainability principles are applicable to them, and also to cover them with proper GHG accounts. So as you know, RSB has a GHG calculator that covers crop-based biomass and also different type of residuals. And specifically in case of the forest biomass, our stakeholders are not comfortable with models. They understand that to consider models when you are taking counterfactual scenarios or payback times can create a large variability in the results. So it will be very difficult to compare different of certified materials in this type of contest. So we started to discuss about a risk approach, and then this group discussed different type of materials considering the risks related to sustainability. We are talking about social and environmental and economic aspects, and also related to GHG emissions. So this working group covered more than 20 participants from NGOs, from our members, and also experts invited to join us in this discussion. And they have specific objectives to review and clarify our approach, and also to define different specific practices for sourcing different types of wood materials. So this represents our development process. The group started in February this year. We have some rounds of virtual meetings. We have membership and expert consultation. We have a specific consultation related to alien invasive plants. This is a case that South Africa operators are very interested in to discuss and to include in our approach. And then we are in the final stage of discussions. We have all round of working group meetings. We invited these certification bodies and auditors with the expertise of audit to join us, to help us to understand how to verify this. And then we'll have a final membership consultation, and we expect to have this approved soon, probably in the first quarter of 2021, and also to develop specific guidance to how to implement and how to verify. So just to have a general view about the different categories that we listed in our new standard, from end-of-life wood materials, island invasive plants, forest harvest residuals, industrial residuals, short rotation wood crops, and roundwood. And our community already agreed that tree stumps are not eligible, and also roundwood are not eligible for energy, only for biomaterials. Okay, so this is a summary of the examples and comments that we have in our discussions. And then this is how the final document will appear. Yes, we are still under discussions. So the idea is to have the category, different examples of materials under each category, to discuss the sustainability and specific requirements applicable for this type of material. For example, we can have forest harvest residuals, but different types, and then we can consider, in the case of forest harvest residue, the full RCB certification from the Forest Management Unit, and how the GHG calculation will be considered, and if there are other discussions ongoing or to be considered. For example, in case of this type of material, there are additional safeguards related to maintenance of carbon stocks, and probably we will consider the ready-to approach to be included in our standard. And other example, forest industrial process and residuals, different type of materials. We will consider legality of the wood sources, and the GHG calculation started from when the material is collected. So 0 GHG intensity at point of origin. And we have another consideration to check if it's really a true residue. So assessment of the residual's eligibility. RCB has a specific evaluation to check elasticity and economic value rate of materials to really confirm if it's a residue or, for example, a co-product. So to summarize the role of the certification systems, I think that one of the points that was already discussion, I think by Robert in his presentation, is that we have the challenge to balance between perfection and practicality. Yes, when you comment this, I say, oh, exactly, it's part of our role, and really to balance the different views and expectations, but also to ensure commitment to environmental, positive social impacts, to work considering the consensus, to provide real GHG emissions reductions, of course, credibility, traceability, and transparency in every step from the construction of the standards until the end. I think that we also have the certification system now as a very dynamic space for collaboration, for discussions, for dialogue with different type of stakeholders, and not considering one certification system, but also among different certification systems. So this workshop is also an opportunity for us to work with other certification systems and learn together and try to find solutions together. So it's all from my side. Thank you so much. And it will be good to discuss more with you and respond to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aurea. And indeed, also thank you for the open invitation. I think exchanging views from different certification schemes is something which we'll do after the Q&A as well. But it shows the need to collaborate on this topic as well. So we are, again, increasingly running behind time, but there's so much to talk. What I would like to do now is I would like to go back to the first speaker, to Annette Coe. We have had a very rich discussion already in the meantime on house-based, so everybody please look at the house-based as well. Annette, you cannot probably cover all of these questions, so I would like to pick you one or two at most to try to share with the wider audience your thoughts on specific topics that were raised.
Thank you, Martin. I would like to point to the complex question that has an enormous answer potentially from Leo Meyer about what would be the policy recommendations. And just comment that I guess that's something that IEA Bioenergy has looked into for many years now. If you look at Robert's long presentation, you'll see some of the people who've been involved over the past decades in developing recommendations for how to assess the climate effects of forest-based bioenergy or bioenergy systems in general. But I suppose the key messages are that there is no simple answer. There is no generic approach. You need to consider the context of your bioenergy system and what it will be displacing. You need to apply a broad system boundary that will look at, that will capture all the effects, the indirect effects as well, of introducing a bioenergy incentive. And you need to consider the economics as well, as Richard has explained, because incentives for bioenergy change people's behavior. They change prices of wood products, for example. And so it's not a simple answer, but it is worth investing in the analysis to determine how bioenergy can contribute to the decarbonisation by supporting, for example, the other renewables, and to consider the time frame, because I guess we're all happy to think that we could all use solar and wind tomorrow and we wouldn't need to rely on biomass, and we might be able to use our land for other purposes, for biodiversity, for example, and to sequester carbon in natural forests. But the reality is that we need energy today and tomorrow. Biomass is available now. It can utilize existing infrastructure. It can help us to cross that gap until we have decarbonized the rest of our energy systems. There are many hard to decarbonize parts of our energy system, like aviation and long distance transport and marine biofuels, that biomass is probably going to be needed for in at least the short to medium term. And we need to keep an open mind to where bioenergy can fit in our whole energy system. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you so much, Annette. And I would like to move on to Robert. Which of the points you've discussed on house-based would you like to pick up?
Well, Martin, I've been beavering away answering a question while all that was going on. And so it's difficult for me to pick up on them very quickly. I would just say, well, first of all, for those who are interested in the decision tree and the criteria, they are available in reports. Martin, if anyone contacts you saying where these are published, put them in contact with me and we'll try to get the reports to them. The 2 points, I suppose, that have come out of the discussion with regard to my talk and more generally, the first one is an interesting comment to the effect that the forest sector cannot bear the entire burden for the rest of society to meet the net zero emissions goal. In fact, even if it was managed solely for carbon sequestration, it could not do that. So expecting the forest sector to be constrained by the need to contribute towards net zero emissions through sequestration, as well as providing biorenewable substitution potential materials, is a heavily constrained optimization problem that will cause pain pain for those parts of society that rely heavily on the forest industries and its products. But this is true of wider society also in trying to respond to the climate emergency. And every sector is going to have difficulties. And I certainly don't want to pretend that I don't think there are any difficulties. It's a real challenge for the forest sector, and they will need support, as all society does. And I don't have the answers to that one. The last observation I'd make, though, is I was interested to see how the attempts to make catchment level assessments in Richard Peabody's talk, very, very interesting. Really interesting to see a major consumer and indeed producer of bioenergy really trying to get to grips with this problem and address it. It's just really still strikes me as difficult to jump from a set of statistics to a conclusion about the impacts of particular practices on the development of forest growing stock. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying there are some big assumptions about causality in those sorts of analyses, which may be valid, but may not be. But in fairness to Richard, I need to read his reports in detail.
All right, great. And I think in the meantime, a number of the links have already been provided on HowSpace, and we can certainly add more links there for anybody who's interested. Then I would like to move on. Pat, what did you pick up from HowSpace?
Hi, I got some interesting questions. I got questions related to definitions and a suggestion that perhaps we should pay landowners in some way to sequester carbon. I think these questions show how complicated, like the other two speakers have just said, how complicated carbon in forest is, particularly when you're actually also involving a market in the whole thing. And I think really Annette and Robert have said it very well. I personally would like to see practical and pragmatic approaches to getting best practice out of the biomass supply chains, to achieving best practice for carbon sequestration and carbon storage. That's it, Martin. That's all I'm going to say.
Sorry, I forgot to mute myself. Thank you very much and very clear. Let's move on to Linda.
Thank you very much, Martin. I must say that there are a lot of different interesting comments and questions. I'm sorry, I've not been able yet to respond to all of them. The issue of BECCS has come up and the relevance of that in the long run. I think as Fern, we've always been quite critical of investments there, while we see there is also a competition, if you want, in negative emissions with investing in healthy forests that can also deliver negative emissions. So that's on that point. I think maybe to touch on some broader elements is that that was mentioned earlier, that in a bioeconomy as such, it can be a source and a sink. I think that's broadly recognized, but that it needs a balance in terms of a regulatory approach. And at the moment in the EU, 70% of the bioenergy is delivered by woody feedstock. I think that in the long run, it cannot be maintained in light of that balance, if you want. And there was a question about which metrics do you use in terms of verifying the carbon impact of bioenergy. I think that's a very relevant but also complicated question. I think that there is merit in discussing feedstocks. There has been a long debate about the use of whole trees or trunks or stumps compared to forest residues. But I think also there, it's with forest residues, there is still a significant risk if we allow that. So that we need to have a better approach there as well. We can't ignore that in light of the need to have short-term benefits from the bioenergy system. So at Fern, we don't rule out bioenergy as such, but we are very critical on the reliance of wood, and particular for forest biomass and the scale at which we are using it. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda. Very clear. Then let's move on to Richard. What would you like to pick up from the discussion on house space?
Yes, thank you, Martin, and thank you to the other speakers. I'll start straight away by thanking Robert for his presentation and the question he raised about attributing what causes things. And he's completely right. It is very difficult to know exactly what determines one outcome. However, one of the outcomes of doing these catchment area analyses is that I hope we've shown that you can get some numbers, so at least you're taking a decision about an outcome on which there is some kind of agreement. And the catchment area analyses themselves do give the reasons why there might be one cause for sustained productivity or inventory. So Robert's asked exactly the right question, and I think we'll all continue asking that to ourselves. The other, I was asking a question about forest measurement, and I can foresee that there will be continuing debates about how we measure forests, whether it'll be remote sensing or national inventories. And I think that'll be another subject where we all have to sit around a table and be prepared to talk with one another to come up with answers where we're all looking at the same version of the truth, as it were. But thank you for the questions I've had on house space. I'll continue to try and answer them, and I'll let other speakers speak.
All right, and maybe too important to point out that the house space website will also continue to remain online. So even after this workshop has finished, it will still be possible to put, well, at least for the speakers to answer questions, hopefully also to put up new questions, because I see a very interesting string of debates unfolding. Let's move to the final speaker, Aurea. What did you pick up from house space?
Okay, so there are interesting questions. There is an interesting question about how we will demonstrate the requirements for different type of materials in practice. For example, in case of early thinnings, how we will confirm that it comply with our specific requirements. So as I explained, we are in the development of this standard, and we will be engaged with our certification bodies. So the view from the auditors from the field side to have the experience and checking evidences will be crucial for us to construct the guide to implement this standard. So we define it as a group, the standards, the requirements, but we really need to check, and then it will be crucial for this. So I think it's very linked to the certification schemes activities to ensure practicability, and also that any requirement are auditable and can provide a very clear message to the market and other stakeholders. So, and there are other interesting questions that I will respond about why we are excluding roundwood and what are our criteria for this, and also how we are considered GHG emissions for forestry harvesting residuals. So I will provide additional responses along the page. Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Aurea. So this have been exactly 2 hours already of presentations and interaction through a house space, and we will keep you busy a little bit more. We had actually planned also a breakout session. I think in the interest of time, we will skip that. However, similar to what Aurea described for RSB, also SBP is considering how to improve, taking into account carbon issues and greenhouse gas emissions, climate benefits into account. For that, we have prepared a number of statements, which I think are also for wider audience, regulators and other certifications, highly relevant. So if you move to the top of if you look at the top, you will see that webinar for discussion has now appeared. So I would like to all ask you to click on top. Don't worry, the main website will remain online, and you can also still post questions and answers there. But we would like you to move to the webinar for discussion. Perhaps Dirk, you can share your screen so that everybody can see it.
And there's also a link directly to it in the Zoom chat box. So you just need to click on it and it takes you exactly where you need to be.
All right, great. So again, on top of the, yes, there we go. On top of the screen, you can see webinar for discussion. What we'd like to do is we actually would like to see, we would like to ask you a number of questions and ultimately put to the question you, what can we actually agree on? Where, I think it's very easy, as we can see also from this chat ongoing, where there's disagreement. But I think one of the things we would like to explore is also where can we actually reach a level of agreements on various topics. For that, I would like to introduce Matt Ford. He's senior consultant at FSA, supporting government, industry, and finance institutions. And he's also a very active member of the SPP Carbon Working Group. And together with the Carbon Working Group, they have devised a number of questions. And I would like to ask Matt to briefly introduce them and then I'm going to explain how we're going to do this.
Thank you, Martin. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matthew Ford. I work for Ethica. We're an independent consultancy who focus on advising governments and business how to source agricultural and forestry commodities sustainably. I have a background in biomass. I spent 10 years in the departments for transport and energy and climate change in the UK government, helping to develop sustainability criteria for transport biofuels and for heat and power biomass. And I was part of the EU negotiations on ILUC and on RED 2. So I have a bit of a background in this space. SPP, as Martin said, have been looking to update their standard. It was established in 2015 to enable the demonstration of compliance with biomass sustainability requirements across Europe. And 5 years on, the time now is to ensure that the standards remain fit for purpose. We have something of a focus on ensuring that the SPP facilitates the economically, environmentally, and social responsible use of biomass to enable climate goals to be met. And this process has been going on since well before the summer. There are 3 key working groups looking to update the standard across the piece. There are 15 sub-working groups who are picking up lots of cross-cutting issues, working with each other. There's a very large piece of work going on to think about how to move SPP's standard forward. And in particular, I've been asked to chair the Forest Carbon Working Group. We've been sitting for a number of months now, and we're starting to get an understanding of what practices may ensure that forest carbon is maintained or increased. And that's kind of been our watchword for our activity. So I couldn't resist taking the opportunity to use this webinar to ask a few questions, and I'll get on with it, Martin. I appreciate we're short for time and I've done plenty enough introduction. This particular question asks you, and I'm welcome for you just to start answering the questions. In those forests where feedstock for biomass production is derived, is it enough to maintain carbon stocks, or should these carbon stocks be increased? There are 4 questions just there. The first is, if you answer 1 to 5, where 1 is you strongly disagree and 5 you strongly agree, can carbon stock in the supply base, should it be maintained as a minimum? And the second question, should the carbon stock be increased? The third question is, the rate of sequestration is more important than carbon stock. And this is a topic that many of the speakers spoke to. There were kind of both roles that are important for a forest. So we were interested to find out whether you felt that sequestration did have a priority of importance over carbon stock or not. And finally, of course, in answering these questions, it's important to consider the payback period. And that was one of the opening icebreaker questions that we saw earlier. By which should carbon stock payback periods be? How long should it be, and should it be defined by? We'd welcome your answers to those, and questions would be most welcome. Martin, over to you to facilitate that.
Sure. So I think one of the things we are looking for is not just the right or wrong answer on any of these points, but just as much or perhaps even more on your comments. So I think the principle of maintaining carbon stocks is already included in the RD, but the question is whether it should be more than just maintaining, whether it should be mandatory increased, whether it should be linked to payback times, etc. And as such, obviously it's extremely difficult to frame these questions in detail. We would be interested to get your views in general. And we would, again, also very much welcome comments on the right-hand side, how important and which aspects of storing carbon stocks will be, which are important. We understand that this is something which you need a little bit of time, so we reserved 4 minutes in total. So please take some time. I will also not stop talking in a minute. Please take a look at the questions. What we will do is we will very briefly give you some time to comment and also to vote. And then Dirk, when are we going to show the results?
Yes, I will show them halfway through. It's when we've got a good representation. At the moment,
Perfect.
We've over 30 votes coming in.
Great.
And I just want to mention, it's like Nicholas has actually been replying to one of the comments. That's exactly what we would like to do, is we would like to get a discussion going. There's no right or wrong into it there. We want to learn as much as possible where you stand, what is important for you, and like and reply to all the different points as you go forward. And now it's time for us to shut up and give people the remaining 2.5 minutes of silent time.
Yeah, just one comment, Dirk. I think Mary is commenting that it's not possible to answer just one of these questions. So I'm not sure what the technical problem is, if it's a technical problem. But in any case, let's see the results because we're around 2 minutes. And I may have to refresh my website as well. To see. I don't see any results yet, Dirk. Also not on the shared house screen.
Here you go. Oh.
There we go. So very briefly to explain, I think 5 was very much agree and 1 was very much disagree. So we have a fairly high agreement on carbon stock should be maintained, a slightly less high moderate agreement on that they should be increased, a very neutral point of view that the rate of sequestration is more important than the carbon stock, and similarly, a very neutral view on the payback period time. So indeed, we see one very clear example, that is, I guess, the minimum, which has already been implemented in the RD, that carbon stocks need to be maintained. But again, we would also be interested in hearing your thoughts on whether these criteria are enough, or what are the boundary conditions, for example, time scale, landscape or forest, stand level, what you consider also relevant yourself. Those are perhaps even more important than what you voted here. So we'll give it another 20 seconds or so, because we have more questions lined up and we really have a lot of ground to cover, and we definitely also want to have some time for plenary debate at the very end, which is always juggling in these very lively debates on how to distribute time. All right, I think we have 4 minutes past. So I would like to ask Dirk whether he can move to the next question also on the screen.
Yes, for you, if you go to the bottom of the page and you click next, that should get you onto the next page, and I will show it here, and then Matthew can introduce it.
Thanks, both of you. So the next question asks, how can the maintenance of carbon stocks in forests be demonstrated in practice? So of course, in answering the question of whether forest carbon stock is indeed maintained or increased, we need a certain level of indicators and metrics. And these questions sort of ask to what extent you can do that. And I think this sort of picks up on what Robert Matthews was saying earlier about, I think there are sort of, you can take a very detailed approach where you do GHG, very clear estimated calculations, or you can take an approach that uses a good biomass approach that you bases on certain levels of principles, or you take a very safe approach, or you base on feedstock approach. And these 4-5 questions here kind of can help to inform one of those sort of routes for addressing forest carbon.
Great, thanks, Matt. Right. I think we can start the timer. So again, we understand quite a bit of questions, and there is no perfect answer here. But we would be interested mainly, especially in your comments and your recommendations, what not so much perhaps what is the correct or wrong answer, but more what is the relevant time frame, what is the relevant geographical frame, what would be adequate modeling tools, etc. Did we miss very crucial aspects in these questions? All of this would be extremely helpful to inform the debate. And so we will give it another 1.5 minutes, and then again we will show the preliminary results from the voting so that we can also see where there is possibly some consensus, or unfortunately this tool does not allow it to show the distribution of the votes, which is perhaps something which we need to look into for the next workshop or so, because that would allow us to give us also an idea of whether there's really consensus or whether it's just 50% on 1 and 50% on 5 if the average is a 3. Dirk, would you actually be able to look that up later on?
Yes, later on we can do it. Unfortunately, it doesn't show it real time.
Okay, so in any case, the numbers are not going to be used in any way. I see a question up from Mary to take any decisions or so. It's just to test and to see how much the audience here is in agreement or not, and to see whether, and with the online participants here, how much agreement or disagreement we can find on different statements. But again, I think it's more important to put the comments on these questions, how important you think maintenance of carbon stocks and how this should actually be demonstrated in practice is, rather than there is no correct answer as far as we are concerned. So we have another 10 seconds, and then I would suggest, or you actually have already shared the results, Dirk, I think.
Yep, the update. Great. We have about 35 coming in at the moment.
Okay, so I see 134 participants, which is not bad after 2 hours of intensive presentations and debate, but that also means that plenty of people still need to vote or could vote if they're interested. So maybe take a look. I think the one where we have most agreement upon is again the first, that harvesting on a sustained yield basis is required, and that the harvest rate is less than the growth rate. Where there is definitely less agreement is the second, the third and fourth question. It's especially modeling seems to be not a very, a point where most participants agree with the avoiding certain feedstock types also being very, very, well, undecided, I would say. 2.6, I think we've seen the approach by several proponents today that specific feedstock types, for example, RSB, and also Linda has proposed that we could rule out perhaps specific feedstock types. But if I look at the overall average here, it seems to be fairly undecided. And perhaps the last one, soil carbon, again, it seems to be a slightly more agree than disagree, but no very clear vote here.
Yeah, and the latest population number is 60 people have answered the votes.
Okay, well, let's give it another 40 seconds before we move on. And again, if you have some more ideas or discussion points about this, please put them in the comment box. And maybe take a cup of coffee in the meantime. All right.
Yeah, so the latest count is 65 people have participated in the poll.
Okay, that's about half of the online person. So I also think if you are not comfortable in answering these questions, then obviously please don't. I think 50% is a good show rate. Then let's move on to the next question.
Thank you, Dirk. Thank you, Martin. So I think the next question is, from a carbon perspective, what requirement should be placed on wood processing residues compared to feedstock which is directly harvested? Now, I think we've all heard that there are uses of both sawmill residues and other processing residues, and that some of these have got very low risks. And we've also heard about the uses of forestry residues, and these can also have low risks as well. But in both instances, there are kind of various considerations before we can kind of take a very clear view on that. So we wanted to ask these questions to get a feeling for the room on whether you felt that processing residues needed a separate set of requirements to forestry residues, whether they can have the same, whether it's sufficient that we know that the biomass has come from harvesting on a sustained yield basis. There are a number of other points here that I'll let you read as you go through, but hopefully that gives you a brief introduction.
Yes. So Dirk, please start the timer. Excellent. And I think this is, of course, a very important question as well. I think traditionally from an LCA point of view, for example, waste streams were regarded as having no carbon footprint, that is only the second you touch them, you start counting. But that does not necessarily mean that there shouldn't be sustainability requirements also from the wood they were originally coming from. This debate, for example, also in the Netherlands has been going on since 2013, when initially the agreement was indeed that there were no sustainability requirements needed, but I think especially NGOs have now said clearly that they would like for them to come from sustainably managed forests as the rest of the wood as well. So I think again, the views have changed a little bit over time here, and especially from SPP also, as of course the wood processing residues are a substantial part of the overall feedstock use. We are interested in the views of the participants here, whether the initial point of the fact that it's a processing residue is enough should be sufficient, or whether you would like to have additional requirements such as avoiding displacement effects or applying the same sustainability requirements for the residues as for the main product. As basically, of course, as soon as you turn a residue into a new product, it becomes a valuable resource as well. So maybe, Dirk, we can turn on the preliminary results.
Yep.
All right, so it seems that especially the avoiding displacement effects has the largest concern here. So for example, sawdust can be used for medium density fiberboard applications, etc. And there are other applications possible for materials. So I think there the audience here has the biggest concern. There's about 20% say no, nothing is needed addition on top of the fact that they're process residue. I think there's one question about what a real process residue is. So I think in this case, it's really something which comes out of a point source, for example, sawmill or a pulp and paper mill. So basically an industrial site where woody biomass is processed into materials and where there are leftover streams, which are not the primary intention of that factory. So basically a sawmill hopefully will not make sawwood with the intention to also produce massive amounts of sawdust. All right, how many votes do we have, Dirk?
60 in total.
Okay, that's I think more or less what we had last time. So let's give it another 15 seconds or so, but I think in the interest of time, and we have 3 more rounds of questions left, let's move on in a few seconds or so. Yeah, I suggest we skip the last minute. I think we have plenty of input and comments.
Okay.
As I said, it's a trade-off between this and debating in public. So let's go for giving a bit more time because we have 40 minutes left or so. Let's go to the next question then.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Dirk. So the next question is, even if forest carbon is maintained, burning biomass generates carbon at the chimney or the stack. From a carbon perspective, under what circumstances can biomass be acceptable part of the energy mix? I think we've heard from many of the speakers today that there are lots of different sort of roles that biomass can play in a transition to net zero and at net zero. So the question really is, under what conditions, particularly for the forest, should biomass sort of be undertaken? And hopefully that's give you an introduction for this kind of question. Back to you, Martin.
Thank you, Matt. The timer is running, and also from my side, I think this is one of the key aspects that we're also looking at and wrestling with within SPP, and I think other systems as well. We saw that RSB actually links the use of biomass to specific end users. For example, that roundwood is not eligible for the use of energy, just for materials. So there's a clear link between the end use and also within the end use. I think there in the Netherlands, we've seen different debates in the past years where now the consensus is that we should move away from, let's say, baseload electricity and use of biomass for space heating, at least on the long term, and move to higher value applications for example, transport, such as aviation and shipping, but also bio-based chemicals, materials, and perhaps also even for still some time, industrial heat, where it's difficult, basically where other renewables have a harder time to fill the gap. So here the question is indeed whether the end use should matter at all. I think we've heard Petri at the beginning of the workshop 2 hours ago, clearly expressing his view that we should have sustainability of forest regardless of the end use. But I guess there's other views who say, well, the end use matters. So again, we would like to hear from you if and which end uses are relevant. Please let us know. How are we doing in terms of votes? Dirk?
62.
I think people are already jumping ahead and answering. Very good.
Even more. It's yeah, 66.
All right. Good. I think we should move on to the next question. I think there is still, well, maybe let's give it a few minutes. I see now comments coming in, so I understand that people also need some time to think and type. Let's give it another minute.
We spent quite a bit of time putting all those questions together. I think let's give people those 4 minutes or 3 minutes to really process this and formulate their contribution.
I appreciate your advice as technical facilitator. You're right. So we should give people the chance. Again, it's also a bit of a challenge for me to balance the timing. We had also planned a breakout session, which I think we will just sacrifice in the interest of the public debate at the end. But we also would like to use the tool House Space to its maximum. So I think it's a very powerful tool to have all our participants provide written feedback. And this is certainly also registered and appreciated. And I think people can also, again, engage with each other online. So it's a different way of engaging than previously pre-corona, but at the same time, it creates a very rich amount of content, which we're very happy with. So we'll give it another minute. And I would also encourage all the participants to look through the answers of the others, perhaps like or reply to that if you agree or if you don't agree.
Yeah.
Well, we have the last 20 minutes, 20 seconds, I mean, on the clock.
So the latest count is 75 people have participated in the poll.
That's great.
Yeah, and if you're worried that the numbers don't add up to 75, you have the chance to actually click multiple answers. So that explains the difference.
Yeah, indeed. Good.
Okay.
Then let's move on to, I think, the final set of questions.
So the final set of questions, as you can see, asks about the substitution question around whether biomass should replace or can replace longer life end uses. So the first question, and the questions are related, asks biomass used for energy production should not displace other longer life end uses. And the second question relatedly then asks, the displacement of forest products to biomass from longer life end uses is unlikely, given the low grade nature and value of biomass feedstocks.
So we combine these two questions, so it's clearly about cascading. I think, Dirk, you just put the questions all in one big page, is that correct?
Yep.
So if you're now lost, please move to the bottom of the discussion page. That's where the final question is. And again, let's give it first some time for people to vote and also to comment.
Yeah, I have already 40 people answering the polls.
right. Let's have a look at the results then. So I think the first question, that biomass used for energy production should not displace other longer life end users, there's a fairly high amount of agreement on. The fact whether this is already regulated by the magic hand of the market, i.e. that longer life products have basically higher value than low-grade applications for energy, there is a, what is it currently? 3.4. So there's slight agreement, but more neutral than agreement. So there's some people who think, yes, the market actually is at the moment in a way that their high-value products will get priority based on the economic value and thus will not be used for energy. But I think there's also quite a significant share of participants who think, no, this is not automatically the case. So we might need some regulation on this or some guidelines at the least. Again, happy to see so many comments coming in.
Yep, just to give you an overview, it's been 60 people have participated in the first question and 66 in the second one.
Very good. Let's give it the final 1.25 minutes, and then we'll move to the very final plenary part of this workshop. All right, another 20 seconds or so. And I think also in terms of votes, we are basically where we were 2 minutes ago.
Yeah, 60 and 67.
Great. Good. All right, that brings us to the end of this, let's say, set of questions. I saw some points that they were oversimplified. I can assure you that we spent quite some time on trying to find the right level between oversimplification and getting it too specific, which would raise the opposite, let's say, concern. But again, I think what we attempted to do here was really to get an idea of where people are standing on a number of issues. And I think what I would like to do now and the very final part of the plenary is to pick up the initial point where we, one of the objectives of the workshop. I think we've seen plenty of different approaches. We've seen plenty of different views. And I think we knew from the start that there would be no way in this workshop we will get a clear consensus on any matter or all matters regarding to woody bioenergies for energy. But we would like to hear from you what, in your view, are, let's say, the relevant points where we have, or perhaps more relevantly or realistically speaking, where we might achieve consensus. What are the issues which you feel, based on what you've seen so far in the presentations, but also in the questionnaire and the feedback from the other participants, where you think there is the possibility to reach a consensus between the various stakeholder groups, which we have mentioned at the beginning. So industry stakeholders such as biomass producers, forest owners, end users. On the other hand, NGOs, scientists, and ultimately also regulators and the people facilitating, for example, certification schemes. Where do you think, where do you see the option of coming up with a way either to regulate or to encourage voluntary practices to stimulate the use of good climate beneficial biomass. And for that, I think, Dirk, if I'm not mistaken, we had a very final page where people could also put their comments there based on what we're supposed to get from the feedback groups. Is that correct?
Yes, I can enable that. Just 1 second.
Yes, please.
And for the final round is when you would like to make a contribution, it would be great if you could just switch on your video. That moves you up to the first page because we have 3 or 4 screens full of black tiles, and it makes it, of course, a lot more personal.
Yes, so my proposal would be if you have a topic where we think we can all find consensus, this is definitely where everybody can support, or where everybody says that's, for example, a feedstock like trunks or so. I haven't heard anybody saying that trunks are the brilliant feedstock. So let me hear it. What do you think are topics where we can all agree that it's good or it's bad biomass? And if you want to also elaborate on this online, please turn on your webcam. I will give it, let's say, 4 or 5 minutes, because this is something to think about. And then we will spend the remaining 25 minutes finally giving you also a voice. I understand that writing on house space is nice, but perhaps also giving you a voice in this is very important. So as you can see at the bottom of the page we have now, what could we agree on session? And I think I can already see some answers. If you're really interested to also elaborate on these answers, then please turn on your webcam. And I actually have to change my window because I don't think I can see everybody right now. Give me a second.
Yeah. So Martin, should we give people 2-3 minutes?
Yes, I agree. Let's give everybody some time to put down their views on where we could actually agree upon. Based on that, I still think there will be plenty of this time to discuss what we don't agree upon. But let's start with the points where we could actually agree upon. And perhaps also to encourage others to see where we have most agreement or so. If you like, I can already see that happening, responses by others. That would be very useful. So write your own answer, but also see what others have written, like it, what you think you agree with. And then we can have some of the contributors explain their views online. And unless I'm mistaken, I only see Dirk and myself with cameras on, but that may also be due to the fact but I don't see other people having turned on their camera. So if you also be interested to explain of what you wrote in the house space on where you think we can agree upon, please turn on your camera. All right, so I see Flavio and Francis so far.
Yeah, and Martin, perhaps the easiest one is if you would like to make a point or so, if you can press on under the participants where you can have this raise your hand functionality, because that signals us that you would like to make a statement. Otherwise, it's hard to see across multiple screens if you're
okay. So because I thought that Housepace would, or that Zoom would sort everybody who wants to make a statement. So then indeed, please, everybody who would like to post a reaction, please use on the bottom, there's a reaction. You can either do the thumbs up or the wave hand sign to show that you would like to make a contribution. And I'm trying to jump between, if anybody has done that so far. And this is perhaps a bit of a drawback of Zoom because it doesn't put those people up front, at least not in my version. Dirk, do you see any hands?
No, not yet. perhaps it's easier to go and ask perhaps some of the different stakeholder groups or sector groups of what their feeling is of what their perspective is on things.
Sure. So maybe I'm trying to think what way to structure this. Let's start with the A of academics. Perhaps that's a bit of a bias myself as I'm a academic, but let's hear some of the academics reflect on what we've heard so far. I think Gustav, I've seen him online. He's definitely an academic. Gustav, would you be willing to comment?
Well, comment my comment then. Now, the thing I did write in there was that in my world, at least, forestry and the forest harvest is not at all driven by bioenergy. It's a low-priced commodity. That's sort of the general thing that I think we can conclude. The exception would then be some developing countries, maybe, where actually energy would be the prime. I'll give that as a test balloon. I mean, we have, some of us at least have seen figures on how much that is energy. And it might appear substantial in a country like Sweden, but most of that is process energy in the forest industry.
Okay, then maybe let's move on. I think I saw Alex Mason, who was our presenter at the very first workshop, perhaps to respond to that. Alex, are you online?
Sorry, yes, I am online, and hello everybody. I'm afraid I had other commitments, so I wasn't able to join earlier, but I look forward to watching the presentations afterwards. Yeah, just on that point, I think we're not convinced that that's the case. I mean, we know from some of the NGOs that are working on bioenergy issues in the US, for example, or at least this is what they would say, is that, you know, forests, the economics have been changed as a result of the new market for pellets to be exported to the European Union, such that it is become economic to harvest forests that in the past would not have been harvested. And we're not saying, obviously, that you know, in most cases, or even perhaps any cases, you know, foresters will be harvesting valuable saw logs and burning them when there's a better use for those things. But equally, I think it's wrong to say that, you know, the bioenergy has no, EU bioenergy policies has no impact at all on the level of harvesting or the level of biomass extraction. And I think the other point I would make is that, you know, the fact that from a commercial perspective, a harvest residue might not have any particular value, or certainly not a high enough value to have any other market, that doesn't necessarily mean that from a climate perspective, it makes sense to burn it. You know, there are things that would have persisted on account of decay rates for a long time. You know, if you have a tree stump in some cool temperate forest, I mean, that's going to lock up carbon for a long time, decades potentially, and therefore you're not going to get a significant carbon or climate benefit compared to fossil fuels by burning that. So I think it's not just a question of the commercial value of a waste or residue.
All right, maybe have somebody from industry respond to that, how they see it. So we saw the presentation from Richard. Is there any other forest owner perhaps also who would like to respond to this? We all had a few online. I'm maybe ambushing my colleague and co-chair Mike Williams a little bit with this, but as Westerveld is a forest owner, Mike, would you be interested to respond? I'm not sure if he's actually online. I saw him a few minutes ago. Well, we have more stakeholder groups. So again, the question was whether we have points to agree on. I think here we already found that Alex did not entirely agree with the previous statement. Is there any other statement anyone would like to raise up?
I could defend the statement at least. I didn't say it didn't have any impact. I said it doesn't have a major impact. The major impact comes from other products. It has the potential to be the major driver, but we are not there.
So what would be then the way forward to ensure that it has the potential? All right, I think I actually had to be honest, I expected a very vivid debate on this, but I think everybody may be very tired. I would still like to raise a few points, which I would like to hear some voices on. I think, again, the purpose of this workshop was to consider ways to move forward, and we've heard several ways to move forward today. There have been the proposal of what Robert would call blunt instruments, so basically specifying specific biomass types which can be used for energy only. We've heard the proposal that we should use risk-based approaches and take a look at, let's say, sustainability and carbon stocks in a certain supply basin region, monitor those, and if as long as they increase, basically we're doing good. There is other proposals being proposed, for example, the more elaborate decision tree by Robert, and I'd be interested to hear from the participants which of these different possibilities do you think are most relevant? Where do you see most promise, or where do you see the bottlenecks? Anyone?
Martin, perhaps it's just the sheer size of the groups that we've still got about over 100 people or nearly 100 people online. Do you think it would we would still have the time to just do a very short, quick bus group and get people really just to go and talk to a few people and just share a little bit about what they've heard and see, or would that be completely overstretching it? But it might be a little bit more convivial to talk with a few people that you can actually look at.
Well, we have about 15 minutes remaining, so I'm just wondering whether we will then have time to actually feedback. Alex, I see your hand up.
Oh, sorry, maybe I'm coming to this fresher than some other people who've been on the call, but maybe I could just be, in the interest of provoking a bit of debate. I mean, it seems to me that on the list of things that we could agree on, or at least I would hope we could agree on, are, for example, that in some cases, bioenergy can increase emissions very dramatically compared to fossil fuels over a climate relevant timescale. Mm-hmm. So although obviously we urgently need to phase out all fossil fuels, the fact that we as NGOs sometimes criticize certain types of bioenergy doesn't mean that, we support fossil fuel use, but I think, we find it difficult sometimes in policy debates, because what we hear from some stakeholders is that biomass can never be worse than fossil fuels, and I think that we must accept that that's not the case, at least in climate terms. The other thing I put in the comments that I thought we might all agree on is that dedicated harvesting of forest or specifically for bioenergy will tend to increase emissions compared to fossil fuels, again, over a climate relevant timescale, meaning realistically, 5 or 10 years, because that's how long we have to stop runaway climate change. And therefore, any solution that doesn't tackle the question of feedstocks, so what you're burning, isn't going to prevent incentivizing bioenergy that will accelerate climate change. So the third thing I would like for us to be able to agree on is that the current Renewable Energy Directive and the LULUCF regulation together do not exclude dedicated harvesting of forest biomass or the burning for energy of things that we know will increase emissions compared to fossil fuels. In other words, we know that the current EU rules are not strict enough and need to be changed. So I'm sure there will be people who don't agree with that. Maybe they'd like to explain why.
Well, yes, and I think the first person who raised his hand was Robert. So let's hear it from Robert.
Hello, everyone. Has it gone dark in my house? Oh no, you can see me, I think.
We can
At least
see
I'm
you.
lit up by my screen. Yeah, it's difficult. I have to say, I think there might be a bit of fatigue at the end of this long proceedings. And I just, first of all, like to say how much I have appreciated the presentations by all the speakers and also the excellent discussion on house space. In terms of points that I might try to offer that we could agree on, they're not particularly helpful points, but here they are. I was scribbling rapidly. If you wanted to, first one is, if you wanted to work out the impact on emissions of burning a quantity of harvested wood for energy, you can't do it simply in the way that you can for fossil fuels. And this is a problem, because once you get into the complexities, then this is where uncertainties can arise, particularly over counterfactuals, and this is where disagreements can also come in. So, okay, it may be a negative point we can all agree on, but I would hope that was one point we could all agree on. And a second one is, and I haven't quite bottomed out what the thing we'd agree on is, but I'm aware that that working out the consequences of supporting a biomass industry for energy in a region can have a number of impacts. One impact can be that you will reduce carbon stocks or reduce carbon sequestration because you're drawing down on more of the potential biomass that can come from that forest area. The management may be completely consistent with wider sustainable forest management criteria as we understand them. Nevertheless, there may be negative impacts on carbon stocks simply because you're more actively managing the forest. Now, maybe that's something we can agree on, but then the harder challenge is recognizing the sort of point that Richard Peabody brought to this debate, which is the very fact that you're supporting an industry in this area means that there is investments into the forest land that actually increase the forest area or otherwise enhance the management of that forest area. This is very challenging to prove. I'd love to be able to prove that. Because I think it's a very good story to be able to tell, because then we can all go away and not worry. But the challenge is to really understand all the consequences of a decision to produce another ton of biomass for energy, whereas a decision not to burn or to burn another barrel of oil, although it will have wider consequences, is a simpler problem to assess.
I do think that was useful, Robert. What I also realized is that perhaps while this discussion and only a few people are raising their hands, as Alex again is online, I see plenty of contributions ongoing on house space. So this is perhaps a bit of a dilemma to having both discussions at the same time in parallel. Alex, if you forgive me, I understood from Mike that the previous time I asked him, his computer was locked up. Maybe let's check if he's online in the meantime, to give us a perspective from forest owners, which we haven't really heard so far today.
Okay, Martin, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah. How about rephrasing the question? Ask it once again, and
So basically, I think what we've heard today is, well, let's start with the statement from Alex. So he said that we have to acknowledge that if we would, let's say, burn, biomass, especially entire forests or biomass which has a high value, we could be looking at substantial times longer than what would be possible from a climate point mitigation perspective that's useful to use for bioenergy. So the question is, can we reach a consensus on that? Are there scenarios, would you acknowledge that, where there is really no climate benefit within relevant timeframes?
Well, as a forest owner, the amount of money that we invest in our silvicultural practices, there's no way we could afford to have any of that burned. We couldn't sell it at those low prices. We're investing in our forest to grow for salt timber, and that's going to a higher valued market. So there is no one that I'm aware of in the bioenergy sector that could afford to pay us what we need to be paid for that material. So to me, it's a bit of a conundrum. I don't see that as being a viable outlet for the material. I just don't see that happening.
Well, then maybe let's go to the point of residues, which I think is also heatedly debated on house space, and perhaps bring Alex back in the conversation, because the definition of residues is also always a thorny issue. How would both of you define, let's say, residues from commercial forestry, which could deliver, in your view, climate benefits? Alex, maybe you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think, you know, if you look at things like, I don't know, mill residues like black liquor and sawmill residues, you know, other things that are produced and that would either be burned anyway to be disposed of, or would decay very quickly, would simply be, you know, might even be landfilled or something like that, then, you know, and that have no other existing market, then, you know, it seems clear to me that you might get a significant carbon benefit if you're displacing fossil fuel use over, you know, a very short time period, and that's clearly worth having. The caveat, I guess, is that, you know, as I say, some residues, forest harvest residues, will take a long time to decay, might need to be left in the forest for protection of soil and soil fertility and therefore regrowth rate. And even some mill residues, I mean, things like towel oil and so on, you know, in some places anyway, some geographical locations will have other uses and are being used by other industries to produce products. And where those, you know, where that demand is displaced by burning them for energy, that will also have an impact on the calculation of the carbon impact. But I mean, I agree with Robert that, you know, it's not necessarily a simple matter, and that's why we've been sort of arguing in the past for some relatively simple rules of thumb rather than the sort of very complicated provisions that you have in the Renewable Energy Directive, which actually don't really, as I say, exclude the stuff that's damaging.
Yeah, I guess that's the dilemma which Robert was also referring to, the simplicity of crude rules, but also, let's say, the potential underutilization of biomass, which might be interesting to use and might deliver carbon benefits after all. I have one more topic, which I think was also raised or discussed in the house space, is which we see, unfortunately, all over the globe. Unfortunately, this morning it was on the news that in Australia, record temperatures have been reached already. Forest fires are likely to emerge very soon. We've seen terrible forest fires in BC, in California and other parts of the world. We've seen drought, we've seen insect infestations due to, let's say, temperatures not getting low enough in BC. How do people see the impact of global climate change, ironically, on forests and the implications of bioenergy? So what do we have to do with our forests, and can bioenergy play a role in, let's say, on the one hand side, using damaged biomass, so salvage wood, etc., and at the same time, could biomass be part of the solution to strengthen our forests? Linda?
Yeah, hi. I don't think as a speaker I was able to raise my hand through the Zoom meeting, but no, happy to say some words on that. I mean, as Fern, as I said in the last remarks of the presentation, is that we think that the current state of forest and the climate ambition that we have in the EU is a good provides a good momentum for different way we manage forests in the EU. I think that that especially in the EU, there is a potential to gradually move away from kind of the monocultures that we have and that don't provide a lot of other ecosystem services than wood. So there is scope for the development of more mixed forests, also forests that can deliver higher quality wood, that can deliver those long-lived wood products that you would hope can deliver more in this circular economy in the long run. So, and can deliver on other fronts, so on climate in terms of the total sink, but also on biodiversity, water and soil quality, and so on. And that in the end can help increase the resilience of forests in Europe, which is something that is especially needed in light of a warming climate going forward. So, and that will hopefully help you also to protect forests against pests and diseases. So, that's a short remark from my end. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else who would like to reflect on the increasing impact of climate change on forests, and if and how bioenergy could play a role in mitigating those impacts? It seems like we have reached the maximum length of what people can reply to and respond to. I'm also again acknowledging that there is, as I speak, more input being delivered on house space. So I think those discussions are perhaps taking up most of people's attention as well. We have about 4 minutes left. So I think it was a very informative and useful session for us. We've delivered a ton of input, which I think will be used for SPP, but also for the wider setting of stakeholders, hopefully here today. So before I finish off, I would like to give the floor to Adam Harrison to briefly entice you to also join our final workshop in 6 weeks from now in January. Adam?
Hi, thanks very much, Martin. That was an amazing session. I'd like to congratulate the organisers, the speakers, but actually also all the participants for their real engagement in this process. And as Martin says, I'd like to invite you to have another go at it at the next seminar, which is on the 20th of January. And we'll be looking at the social impacts of woody biomass production. And I'm thinking actually we ought to also be looking at the social impacts of woody biomass use for energy, which would be interesting. We'll be able to hear from the industry about the health and safety issues, but also the impacts on livelihoods of forest production. We'll also hear from NGOs about what's happening in other sectors and from service providers to the industry around certification. Several of the speakers have already been organised, but some are still to be confirmed. But I would really love to see as much engagement and participation as we've had today in that process to round this set of seminars off. So hopefully I will see you in January. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Adam. And then it's my turn to also thank, first of all the speakers for spending a lot of time. I think when they agreed to joining this workshop, they didn't really realize that they would have to pre-record a lecture or a presentation online and then give it live in a shortened version as well. I understand this was a massive use of your very valuable and scarce time. And so again, I would also like to encourage all participants, if you haven't done so yet, take a look at those presentations. They really provide yet more information than our presenters have been able to convey already today in those 8 minutes. And last but not least, I would also like to thank, next to the organizing entities here, SPP, IEA Bioenergy, and ET Bioenergy, all of you. I think we've had the highest show up of participants, and we are still in month 8 after the COVID starts, trying to find the perfect way of having an online workshop. But I think having this house space and Zoom calls in parallel adds a lot of value. So we will take a very good look at the comments provided also in hindsight. Again, these websites will be online for the month to come. So feel free to post further both documents or engage in discussions. And last but not least, if you're interested in the further development of SPP and the carbon, let's say, a working group, please let us know. We'd be happy to engage further with you. Dirk, you had your hand raised as last part.
No, it was just a thanks to all the organizers. It was really fantastic presentations coming along. And thanks so much for all the participants. We have over 900 comments, I think, wow, over the 3 hours. So it's a lot of stuff to actually go and look through. And again, it's like the comments from your colleagues and answer and reply to them. It's a good chance to keep a lively debate going.
Okay, great. Good. Then I thank you all again for your input. I'm sure you all need a drink now. I do. And I hope to see all of you in 6 weeks from now on the 20th of January for the final workshop. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Martin.
Thank you,
Wonderful.
Martin. Thank you.
Brilliant job. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Oh, well, I better say goodbye then.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I apologize again for all the technicalities, but I do hope you had fun on Housepace.
Well, your support team were very helpful.
Great, good.
Thanks for such a good presentation.
Very grateful.
Spectacular, Robert. Thank you.
Anytime.
Okay. Okay. Speak
All
soon.
right. Yeah.
Bye
Take
for
care.
now.
All right. Good. Okay, guys. Thanks also to you, Dirk, for making it all happen.
Thanks to you, Martin. It's really difficult to keep the space for 3 hours in a go. Fantastic job.
Yeah, it was also, I was almost a bit surprised at the end. I think people ran out of steam.
Perhaps we should have taken a short 5-minute break at some stage, but then of course we always risk of losing quite a few
people. But I think what is one important lesson is that we see in parallel so much going on in Housepace. So we might even just have a quiet session and then come back to the plenary and have some final reflection from our speakers or so, lessons for the final time.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to sign off as well. My phone is waiting downstairs. I promised my wife to go down at 6. So thanks all again, and we'll speak soon.
Brilliant.
Cheers, Martin.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Everybody.
Dirk, did you need something from me?
I just wanted to discuss a few practicalities. If you still got a minute.
Yeah, sure.
I would just go and I would just go and quickly send you a new Zoom so I can just end this one.
Yeah, good plan.
Okay.
Okay.